Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Georgia Christa, Events Coordinator of Traditional Architecture Group, and I'm delighted to welcome so many of you on our second live symposium, an event that has become now a traditional event. For me personally, as a conservation architect, the theme of this year's symposium, bridging the gap in between conservation and new traditional architecture, it's very important, and we've been quite for some time reflecting on it. In most conferences I've attended recently, both live or online, this topic has surfaced again and again. There appears to be a persistent international misalignment between two professional perspectives. On one side, conservation architects who focus on the repair, conservation, and new extension of traditional buildings. On the other, new traditional architects who aim to design new buildings in traditional manner, not only stylistically, but also through the use of traditional materials and by drawing inspiration from the deep reservoir of knowledge embedded in historical buildings. But why is this gap? Why are all the new traditional designs building perceived as incompatible, despite sharing so many intrinsic values? There is also another gap, the one between the traditional continuous evolution of buildings over the time and the modern conservation ideologies that often inhibit that organic growth. In the name of being of our time, these principles tend to favor discontinuity, contrast, and a kind of museification of the heritage. As a result, heritage risks becoming an artificial intellectual construct, isolated and disconnected from the living flow of culture. This approach ultimately prevents the creation of the future heritage, one that continues and builds upon traditional values rather than severing them. When examining the possible cause of those unnecessary gaps, one likely factor we've identified are some articles from the famous Venice Charter. Originally intended to safeguard historic buildings, the Charter had an enormous impact on historic environment around the world and produced a lot of damage, especially when its guidelines were distorted or over-enthusiastically implemented, or its initial meaning misinterpreted. In 2007, INTBAU made a meaningful contribution to this ongoing discussion on the relevance of Venice Charter nowadays, with the publication of the INTBAU Venice Declaration. The goals of that conference were to closely examine the original text of the Venice Charter, explore the diverse range of contemporary conservation practices, and consider how new traditional design could be thoughtfully integrated into historic context. The ultimate aim was to establish a stronger theoretical foundation for creating new buildings and additions that harmonize more naturally with their historic surroundings. This year, we hope to build on that foundation, fostering fresh insight, encouraging open dialogue, and perhaps even initiating a call for a new INTBAU declaration. In the last 18 years since the last declaration, the context has evolved considerably. A reassessment of where we stand today and where are we heading feels not only timely but essential. This evening's symposium is intending as a starting point for a meaningful dialogue, an opportunity to explore how conservation architects and regulatory bodies, together with traditional architects, can work in collaboration rather than isolation. Our shared goal is to heal the built environment and discover a more natural, integrated path forward, one that carries tradition into the future, but not as a static legacy, but as a living engine of vitality and creativity. I will now pass the baton to Mark Wilson-Jones, the chairman of the Traditional Architecture Group, who will share his thoughts on those important topics. He will also introduce the first panel of speakers, where we have the honor of welcoming 3 of the signatories of the initial 2007 INTBAU Venice Charter, and the editor of the INTBAU Venice Declaration and the Venice Charter Revisited, Modern Conservation and Tradition in the 21st Century, Dr. Matthew Hardy. And I would like to show the publication also. That's a fantastic book, 70 pages thick, 64 articles, as I remember well. It's like a manual of how to use traditional architecture and how to really connect with the environment. Thank you very much. Mark, the stage is yours.
Right, thank you, Georgia. Thank you so much. Now, good afternoon, everyone. It's a wonderful thing to expand the AGM and have this symposium straight afterwards, and to have our audience enlarged and augmented by considerable expertise. So I'm really looking forward to the discussions that should emerge after our brilliant speakers have had their say. So yes, thank you to Georgia, and really just to emphasize the point that Georgia set this up and has also got us going today. So this is just the second TAG symposium. Last year we had a more modest affair, but encouraging, and that was on the subject of the imitation gap. In other words, saying, well, effectively, we all imitate. Let's own up to it, and indeed, let's celebrate it. So there's some continuity here, because tradition and imitation both imply continuity, and it's discontinuity that Georgia mentioned that is part of the problem that we are identifying, this gap, whether it's the gap between conservation practice and new traditional architecture, or the more general gap that was really part of the modernist vision early in the 20th century, and the various consequences of that have followed. So before official guidance, interventions to historic buildings typically happened simply because that was what people thought at the time was the best thing to do, without much agenda, generally speaking. So the problem is that ideas have come in about rupture and discontinuity, but they're accompanied by ideology. An ideology is different, in the sense an idea can be debated and talked about, discussed. There can be disagreements, but an ideology does not really allow disagreement. It's just, this is what you have to do. So it's a problem. And if you had this kind of guidance, the Venice Charter, let's say, epitomizes, obviously there's other guidance, then historic buildings like this could not happen. Because effectively, this is Cordoba Cathedral, and you can see there, if you're attentive, it's basically a classical kind of Baroque ensemble as we see it, but you can see that there's actually Islamic, it's based on an Islamic structure. You can see a bit of it over on the left. Then there's some other phases. There's a bit of Gothic, a bit of ordinary classical, more Baroque classical, and so on. So if you were going to judge that by the standard of modern practice, it just couldn't exist, because it wouldn't get through any committees or any planning applications. So I think this is an important point, an important theoretical point, because after all, conservation and all this guidance is supposed to be honouring history. So it's very strange. So the built environment, generally, it just evolved gradually and organically, you might say, reflecting natural changes in society, culture, and technology. For example, there was the famous effect of taxation on windows, which then would affect the elevations. But those kinds of, let's say, events or laws, they come and they go. But the problem with the Charter and institutionalized education delivered by universities and courses and then taken up by bureaucracies is it's very difficult for them to go anywhere. We're stuck with them, and also they're perceived almost with intellectual sort of justification that they are kind of inviolate, sanctified almost, and actually they need revising. So that's part what all this is about. So the history of architecture, that included lots of revivals and renaissances. And a building like this, Palazzo Farnese in Rome, is clearly going back. It's trying to recover antiquity, the use of the orders and so on. But clearly no one could mistake that building for an ancient Roman building. It's an Italian Renaissance building at the same time. So we have to be able to grasp paradoxes. You can go back and you can go forward at the same time. So Another question that people are involved in is legibility and falsification. And I think even the Cordoba Cathedral example, it just tells us that you can read these things. You have to be pretty blind not to be able to detect phases. And these phases, they happen organically and naturally, and our interpretation of them likewise. So historically, pre-charter, interventions had three great benefits: continuity with the original, being organic testaments of their time, and thirdly, being subtly legible as such. Contemporary post-charter interventions, by contrast, tend to be alien to the original, testaments to rupture and dogma, and thirdly, didactically legible, like a beam hitting you in the eye. So it's quite a different situation. So just a couple sort of these very general points of principle. I'd like to add just a little personal note of my own arrival at thinking about these things. And because I'm both an architectural historian and an architect, but also when younger, I just had no particular training in this area or thought about it, and in fact do not consider myself an expert in conservation. But I was invited over to Lisbon before qualifying to do a project there, and I ended up landed, parachuted in, and living in this place, the Paris of Fronteira, which is one of the most beautiful places on the planet. And the project I was invited to do was this one, which was effectively to enlarge the existing house museum on the right and join it with the building on the left. And what my hosts said was, well, what we're going to do, or what you are going to do, is to make a bridge between these two buildings at first floor level, gut the second building, and the staircase and everything, and put an auditorium in the basement. And I thought, well, pity, I'm going to have to leave Palazzo Fronteira and go back to London, because that, even at the sort of age of 25, is an insane proposition. So I persuaded them, actually, that when you go to the site, you realise that the gap between the buildings is the right size for an auditorium, is the right shape. And why not do it at ground level, which, as you can see, sorry, I haven't got a pointer. You can see that thing. Well, let's not worry about it. It's that little curving bit of building. And then there was a funding problem. And I went back to London. Years later, my friends did this, finished it. And there was this slot that appeared. There was what it should be, and that's the slot. And you think, no, this makes a huge contrast. And the other thing, sort of on a personal note, is I was in the Bath Preservation Trust Architecture and Planning Committee when Eric Parry's proposal for the Holborn Museum came in at Bath. And this got through, and actually I was supporting it, which may be somewhat strange, because I thought, well, Eric's a fantastic architect in many ways, got charisma and does lovely drawings, etc., etc. But when you get the actual result, the nice images, it was supposed to be the same colour as Bath stone, it ends up being dark green, and all sorts of things. And I must admit, I have to, with hindsight, think, maybe that was the wrong decision. So I'd just like to end with the final quote from a modernist master, Alvo Aalto, and I got this from Harry Charrington, who's in the audience just there. Let us not be so dogmatic. It depends. We need judgment. That's all I wanted to say, apart from introducing Matthew Hardy. Now, you're ready, Matthew? Yes, sitting there, right, about to come. So this is due to Matthew's editing. And he is also Senior Lecturer in Architecture at the King's Foundation, Senior Associate Tutor, Department of Continuing Education at the University of Oxford, and likewise at Oxford, a visiting fellow at Kellogg College and co-editor of the Journal of Urbanism. So that's a fantastic set of skills that make Matthew eminently suited to kick us off with the whole problem. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and I hope I can live up to that brilliant introduction. And I really wanted to talk today about the Venice Charter and the Venice Declaration, but I thought one needed a bit of throat clearing before that. So I want to continue on from Mark's observations on what happened before conservation, look at some of the impact of what you might call modernisms, a broad-based movement, not just an architectural style, then look at the Venice Charter and its problems, the problem particularly of contrast, and then moving beyond the Venice Charter and finishing with the Venice Charter revisited. So I'll whiz through this. Please tell me to slow down. As Mark has noted, before we had conservation, people simply added on in ways they thought were best. Here we have the addition 80 years after the earlier part of the building, exactly matching. Here, as everyone knows in the room, probably you have Palladio on the right and someone they think is Carlo Barella on the left, finishing off Palladio's building. So there's a certain amount of respect for existing style there. Surprisingly, even in the 18th century, you find that Milan Cathedral completed, as Rudolf Wittkever documented in his book about it, both respected in the Renaissance in this book by Cesariano, but then the subject of an ongoing and long-term competition with entries both in the then contemporary classical style and in Gothic style. And, we're all happy, I think, put your hand up if you're not, that the Gothic style won, but it was sort of modernised with a few classical windows. And then, of course, there are really contrasting additions that have been done through time, and which I think everyone recognises as valid and memorable images, despite their contrast. But then we get to the 19th century, and I think the effect of modernism is that we feel some sort of distance between ourselves and the past. So we go from Viollet-le-Duc, restoring Pierrefonds before and after, to a marvellous fairy tale castle, very carefully following the documentation of the building itself, because there's no written documentation. And, of course, as famously the case, improving the spire of Notre Dame from its earlier form. After his colleague had died, he was apparently the very first thing he did was to change the plans to a taller spire. And this sort of imaginative restoration really caught on. There's Cologne, as it had been for nearly 600 years after the Black Death, finished off thanks to the discovery of the original drawings. The flesh dating from 1955, I believe, after we flattened it in the Second World War. There's, again, even more dramatic example, this National Cathedral of Norway, finished off in the 20th century. The towers finished in 1969. So I think there's a clear case to be made for a continuity. But what did modernism do to that? Well, first of all, I think going back into the Enlightenment, you had people like Winkelmann classifying architectural history into periods, so that it was no longer a continuity of which one was part and contributing, but a very powerful idea of one style succeeding the other. In Rickman, defining Gothic architecture by the terms you'll find in any parish church guidebook now. I'm sure that's not the way the people who built those buildings thought about them. And then Ruskin, who I will count among the modernists, despite, of course, his writing, because I think he provides a sense of distance between the building fabric and our present age. And in his work, he refers to the utter desolation of the Fondéco de Turkey, that's this very sensitive watercolour before, but suggests that the nobleness of the traces that are left of it represents a challenge to the Renaissance and its values. A new belief that a building has more value as evidence than it does as a working building. There it is, shortly after Ruskin's in a deplorable state. There it is today, following the integrative restoration in the 1860s. And I think many people felt that something had been lost. On the other hand, the one thing that wasn't lost was the building, which probably would not have existed by today if they hadn't done it. And then we come to St Albans Cathedral, which I think is a point at which there's a kind of historical twist, if you like. And there it is before and after Lord Grimthorpe took on personally the job of designing the integrative restoration. And William Morris had something of a a kind of moment with visiting St Albans and finding it very largely changed from what he remembered, and started campaigning against this sort of restoration, and known in late Victorian times as scrape and anti-scrape. Founded the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, whose website, when I last looked at it, said new work should be honestly of its time, our own time. I'm sure Bob will have some reflections on what that might mean in due course. But then we had, I think, the moment in which architectural conservation really came to the fore, and that's post-Second World War. And of course, there were plenty of people who just wanted things put back the way they were as soon as they possibly could, and got their hands dirty cleaning up cities. And some things, of course, were very famously put back exactly the way they were before, and now UNESCO World Heritage listed. But of course, there were others who thought that the war hadn't gone far enough. Lewis Mumford, I'm ashamed to say, quoting, saying that there hadn't been enough demolition from the Blitz. And by the way, if you can find this book, absolutely fantastic book, unfortunately seems to be selling at about €700 second-hand, but an absolutely brilliant book, which was worth tracking down. And so you got this very heavy propaganda element for how much better the world would be after we'd won the war. There's lots of images like this. I particularly like this one from Coventry, where you have the sort of startled children looking at this vision of the future in which the cathedral, surprisingly, is restored, as are the other two big churches, but the rest of it is replaced with a sort of Stalinist Baroque and some big roundabouts, which sort of pretty much sums up what they wanted to do to London after the Second War too. But this certainly started a movement, which we've heard about, in which everything old was bad and everything new was going to be good, and you got perfectly decent houses like these, which needed renovation, doer-uppers, demolished in their hundreds of thousands across this country. So along came the Venice Charter, I think, after this orgy of destruction and reconstruction. Following the Hague Convention of 1954, some of you who've travelled in Europe might occasionally see a little blue symbol on a building identifying it as historic building which is not supposed to be destroyed in the event of war, and it didn't really catch on. So I think they decided to update the Athens Charter with the Charter in Venice in May '64. And I think it's fair to say it was a commendable attempt to create universal guidelines for conservation. And I can take Icomos' own word from this, that it became unfortunately set in stone. It founded a kind of self-appointed international organisation for architectural conservation, emphasised the contribution of all periods to the building, so that sort of put an end to integrative restoration. And unfortunately, I think something was lost in the translation. And I say that literally because the Venice Charter was written by the delegates to the conference as an afterthought. They hadn't thought of producing a document. They wrote it overnight. None of them were native English speakers. A colleague is working on the differences between the French adopted version of the Venice Charter, which is the official version, and the English version, which we believe in this country to be the holy word, so to speak. And I think you probably all know these problems. Restoration must bear a contemporary stamp. Unity of style is not the aim of a restoration. Article 12, replacements must integrate harmoniously and at the same time be distinguishable from the original. So there are internal contradictions throughout the document. And you can illustrate them very simply by just looking around you. Restoration must stop at the point where conjecture begins. Here's a kind of you couldn't possibly emulate Barlow and Ordish's beautiful railway hall, so we have to put a flat thing like a billiard table there that doesn't even line up. It always bugs me when I see that picture. Fortunately, I'm not often hovering over central London. But then I think it leads to all sorts of terrible kind of, needlessly destructive interventions like this one, which you'll see almost anywhere in Italy, where I think it's the Belle Arti commissioners turned up and told them you have to preserve some little fragment of an earlier building because we have to know that this 17th century palace is actually much earlier. It's not enough just to know that because you know it. And then I think when it comes to replacement of parts, it leads to all sorts of extraordinary kind of things like this going on at the Parthenon, where the marble was replaced with new marble to the original profile rather than the cement which had replaced the broken parts in the past and was coloured to match the original. So Important to know about the Venice Charter is that it was always seen as a living document by ICOMOS, and that it was constantly going to be subject to interpretation. And these are just a handful of the interpretive documents produced since the Venice Charter was published in 1964. So if anyone, and I think it's fair to say all of these stand as mute critiques of the narrowness of the Venice Charter, which is literally designed for monuments. And monuments are things like cathedrals, abbeys, the Parthenon, not heritage, not your average row of terrace houses in a back street in London, which are now today listed, as you well know. And I think Alan Blum's contribution to the Venice Charter book was one of the best, where he talks about charters becoming sort of sacred texts by the way they're written. And if you read the Venice Charter, it's written as a sort of a monumental text and becoming monuments themselves. And Boguslaw Smidgen, who wrote, from ICOMOS, who wrote a chapter for us, said it had been intended as a guiding directive supplemented by regional documents or documents concerning specific kinds of heritage. In other words, it wasn't meant to be set in stone. So please remind anybody who quotes the Venice Charter that it's been subject to all of these emendations. So what is the problem with contrast? The trouble is, as this little snippet from building design a few years ago shows, it's practically the only thing most architects have ever heard about conservation. And contrast is therefore their only response to working on listed buildings. Of course, there are many brilliant architects who do different things, as we'll see, but and it starts really probably from reacting to, in Gunnar Asplund's example, to the Charter of Athens in the 1930s. It goes on post-war, the reconstruction of the Alta Pinacoteca, and it goes right up to the present day, and I won't bore you with these images of contrasting additions, but a contemporary idiom that enhanced the innate characteristics of the town, this one says. I don't know what they said about this one, but I'm not really sure that Euston Road needed, that to be so clearly contrasted from the original building underneath it. So where do we go without the Venice Charter? I think some recent work has shown there's a way forward. I think, as several people observed during the meeting, which I was just pleased to be attending, that young people don't share their grandparents' obsessions with modernism and clean modern lines and minimalism. Look at young people. They're different from us. And maybe we can see a more open and inclusive architecture developing, though I'm sure Bob will show us some more depressing news from the world of architectural practice and the front line. And so, these sorts of additions and alterations are less uncommon than perhaps they once were. We even see modernist architects having a go at having some fun with traditional architecture, perhaps in this one in Paris, this one in Islington. I think in a generation when they've painted all the bits that should be painted cream, that will probably blend in quite nicely with the original. And then you find, really quite surprisingly, buildings emerging from the current building environment without any fanfare, like this one in Holborn, which appeared about a decade ago, 7 years ago. And then I want to come to some very recent developments. So there's Viollet-le-Duc Spire, the fire from 6 years ago, the briefly existing competition to have a spire suited to the techniques and challenges of our time, and there'll be a short competition at the end of the talk as to why they didn't do this. But as we all know, fortunately, the reconstruction à l'identique won, and there it is going up. I think the most exciting building project of the last 10 years, in my view, and just extraordinary levels of detail and craftsmanship, of which we can all only dream in our projects. So the Venice Charter Revisited. This was a conference, and thank you for the compliment. But I think I also owe thanks to Bob Adam for the title, the Venice Charter Revisited. I think Bob and I started INTBAU together, and I think it's fair to say it was a joint output of our time there. We had an open call for papers. It was circulated very widely through academic circles. I thoroughly recommend having open call for papers. We got 127, I think, paper submissions. We picked around 60 of them. 19 of them were by women. And then the content of the book has 64 chapters, as has been noted, 19 of them by women. ICOMOS promised us a foreword, but they didn't actually ever deliver it, I'm sorry to say. But Bogusław Smidgen contributed a chapter from ICOMOS, so we got there in the end. The conference, 2 parallel sessions in the madness of the Biennale in Venice, a conference reception at the French consulate in Dorsey-Duro, pulling in a favour from someone that I can't remember how we got to. And we imported our own caterers because the Venetians see you coming if you're doing a conference there. The declaration, largely pulled together and edited by Mike Mahaffey, who I don't think is present, and from a whole host of ideas, and finally signed in January 2007, and later signed by a total of, I think, 125 other members of the public who signed it, and joined, I think, this growing family of emendations to the Venice Charter. Of course, not an ICOMOS document, and one that INTBAU needs to keep promoting as a code of practice. And I'm very nearly finished now. The book from 2009, the paperback from 2010, the hardback, which is just as much a brick as that one, did very well, so they brought it out in paperback. It's still in print, over 550 copies, I think, actually, since this slide was produced, and still on sale from the publisher. There's some talk of doing an update. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That's a brilliant summary of all the context that we need to know. So now we're passing on to Ettore Mazzola, who is just about to stand up. And I should say that I've had pleasure knowing Ettore for many years, common interests in Rome. And he is an architect, a conservation architect, in effect, or what you might call a restorer in old language, and a professor of practice at the University of Notre Dame, and the really important program that is the one really most sort of significant bastion of traditional teaching of architecture in Europe. So that's where Ettore works day to day. And he's a teacher as well, obviously, and does prodigious research. There's lots of publications out there, fantastic website, blogs and stuff. So Ettore is a sort of attack dog, very super energetic and enthusiastic, and just the kind of thing that I think Georgia mentioned earlier, that on the back of this early event online, Ettore gets gets called off to Doha, and I think just this morning he was at Ali Reza's office, Stanhope Gate, doing a presentation there to the princess, or now he has to go and see the emir the day after tomorrow, then he goes to Mexico. I can't keep up. So, but hopefully Ettore will keep it calm for us now and give us his presentation.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the presentation, for the invitation. Thanks, Georgia, for the outstanding way she organized all this. I'll try to be brief. I was very happy to see Matthew's Hardy book. I participated at that meeting, and I also presented on those days a paper talking about the false problem of falsification of history. It's a drama. It's a drama that we invented in Italy a long time ago. At the beginning, this was an interesting thing to protect the black market of antiquities, and then this was extended also to architecture and to urbanism, and now it's terrible. It's very difficult working in restoration, what is happening. But in this case, I'd like to talk about something that is very, very important. What is happening after the loss of some symbol of identity of places, according to these documents. And I would like to quote, sorry, I'm going to read a couple of quotations which to me are fundamentally important to be read, because everybody on this planet is celebrating Cesare Brandi for this horrible document that was produced in 1964, making almost a copy and paste of his theory of restoration of 1963. But in the same period, it was another architect that was working that was Carlo Ceschi. I'm going to quote something that is to me really a cornerstone to restart. But before all, I'd like to quote also a great restorer who passed away, unfortunately, in 2013. Paolo Marconi took part to that great meeting of 2006. And I had the great pleasure to have Paolo as a friend at the end in the last years of his life. And he also wrote the intro to one of my book. And he wrote this great phrase: the trauma of Second World War regarded, above all, the way of conceiving the architectonical object as a something connected to its environs, landscape, village, town, in a linguistic sense, so bound to give people an environment where civil life and development are possible. The eventual traumatic destruction of this environment could cause serious inconveniences, could produce maniacal, depressive states able to destabilize the population. The Second World War had aimed to destroy whole cities, to strike not only the most important industrial centers, but also the biggest number of houses, beginning with the Warsaw, destroyed by the Nazi Luftwaffe on September the 1st of 1939. This was followed by the destruction of Coventry in England, to which English army answered bombarding Munich at first, then deciding in 1942 a series of bombardments directed to Cologne, Hamburg, Kassel, Berlin, Nuremberg, and Dresden. This one shelled on February the 13th of 1945. During the same years, Allied bombarded Italy, aiming above all at the civil objectives in order to demoralize the population and to cause insurrection against the regime. Japan bombardments of Hiroshima and Nagasaki came after, and with them the war ended. Now, what we have to do with this? This is the image before, during, and after the destruction made by the ISIS in Al-Qaeda in the Bamiyan Buddhas. And don't you think that to leave the mark of destruction wrought by ignorant criminals, to erase the identity of place, is to acknowledge the victory of those criminals? These are images of Palmyra before and after the ISIS. And so, following Cesare Brandi's theory of restoration and the subsequent publication of the Venice Charter, the ideology prevalent among many art historians, often lacking knowledge of statics, chemistry, and ancient construction techniques, the dominant thinking in the field of restoration would dictate that nothing that has been lost should be reconstructed, because this would involve a falsification of history. Is it possible to accept a certain dogmatic imposition in the face of the tragedy of the loss of identity, symbol of the people victimized by wars or other tragic events? This is what happened in 1902 in Venice when the tower, the bell tower of San Marco, collapsed. And then it was, thank goodness, rebuilt. But Cesare Brandi said that the authors preferring to make, he was very furious, saying that the authors preferring to make a fake rather than simply put something modern to symbolize the ancient structure. The same thing with the Ponte of Santa Trinita. He said the same accusation. The same thing with the Loggia della Mercanzia in Bologna. So now, I think it's necessary to be, at the end, precise. And if we open any kind of vocabulary, restoration means return a building or a work of art to its original conditions using appropriate repair and reintegration. Differently, where the prohibition of Cesare Brandi theory of restoration 1963 and Venice Restoration Charter of 1964 and Vienna Memorandum of 2005 still prevail, restoration means something else. The more a monument's remake leaves out any addition and try to build a new unity on the old one, the more the remake itself is supposed to be approved. This to avoid a forgery, which, however, makes sense only in the case of works of art and antique furniture, tradable and exportable. Indeed, if you read the three cases of Cesare Brandi's theory, you never find anything like what you find in the Charter. The theory actually has older origins than the Venice Charter, and although never acknowledged, goes back to the brainwashing of rationalist movement that led during fascism to the conception of law and regulation on the architecture and restoration that were never later erased. Point 8 of the instruction for the restoration of the monument of the Ministry of Italian Education said that for obvious reasons of historical dignity and for the necessary clarity in the present artistic conscience, it is absolutely forbidden, even in areas not of monument or landscape interest, to construct building in ancient style insofar as these represent a double falsification of the ancient as well as the recent history of art. What are the side effects of this monist culture? Obviously, thanks to the previous presentation, we know very well Daniel Lipsky in the Ontario Museum or in Dresden. But there is also the risk of the imposition of materials, because it was quoted the Athens Charter of 1931. In the Athens Charter of 1931, the experts have understood the various communication relative to the use of modern materials for the consolidation of ancient buildings and approve of the judicious use of all the resources of modern techniques, in particular that of reinforced concrete. Immediately after the reconstruction, immediately after the Second World War, due to the destruction of the Schola Armaturarum, Amedeo Maiuri made a roof made of reinforced concrete, and on November the 6th of 2020, the roof collapsed and destroyed forever what was remaining of the Schola Armaturarum. But we can go closer and we can see what happened after the reinforcement, the structural strengthening and restoration work by the Superintendent Office of the Church of Anime Sante in L'Aquila, which was consisting in strengthening the dome through the dismantling of the existing cover with the subsequent insertion of arc-welded grid with the steel tie beams, strengthening of the drum through the injection of cement mortar, strengthening of the vault and roof, and of the two side chapels and transept through the construction of a reinforced concrete slab. While they were filming, the dome collapsed. Few months after the inauguration, after this strengthening work, the earthquake destroyed this dome simply because who made the restoration didn't know the technique used by Valadier when he built this church using the wooden chains like in the dome of Brunelleschi and whatever. So the facade remained standing because it was built with the typical ashlar construction of the place. Not far from there, the tower of Medici in Santo Stefano di Sessanio was the only building that was not restored by an Italian-Swedish engineer with an architect who reconstructed the entire Borgo for with the traditional building techniques. Here, a series of reinforced slabs were put, and it was the only building of Santo Stefano that collapsed. These are other examples of collapses of buildings where you can see, in this case, this bell tower in Emilia-Romagna that survived the earthquake despite how it is slim, but the roof of the church that was reinforced with the concrete destroyed the church. This happened also to this building or this building or this building or this tower in Magliano in Tuscany. Would be this, the next one, the Temple E of Selinunte, where you can see already the crack line on the left side because of the reinforced bars put for recreating the fluting, or this, the Temple of Apollo in Pompeii. So in this theory of restoration chapter, War Experiences, the one I mentioned of Carlo Ceschi, he said something very important. On the 22nd and 23rd of October 1942, at the night, the war which involved Italians took decisive turn. During those nights, the blanket and airstrike started to hit Genoa and went ahead against Turin, Milan, and the whole Italian territory. Since then, those people like me who coped with the devastating action of war against the monument realized that all the cautions and balanced restoration theory recently adopted by restorers were seriously affected. Meanwhile, the problem of preserving old towns and historical monuments was becoming tragic. The memory of monuments destruction has always exceeded even human life's sorrow due to the eternity expectancy on monument compared to natural limited human life's expectancies. Urban planning has now considered the war factor, which appeared remarkably important only after the town bombing. A correct restoration plans keeps far from selfish and vulgar ideology interest, as well as it is essential that is the economical factor which always leads any urban decision, and the private interest come after the common interest. We must remember that the facade of private buildings along the streets and piazza are public indeed, since the wall-built environment belongs to all citizens. These were laws, rules of 1930s in Italy. So, whoever is called upon to restore or reconstruct a destroyed monument or urban fabric, putting aside a personal or dominant ideology, must always understand that it's not simply a matter of restoring the artifact, but restoring and rebuilding an identity symbol of people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ettore. It was really great to have the Italian perspective for the key figure, particularly of Cesare Brandi, just to show how sort of ridiculous it all is. But that's a very important start. In fact, still today, is the irony that in Italy, you have the source of all the beauty we admire, practically, and yet they are the last to admit the possibility that if you do any new work, it could possibly carry on with that tradition that they all enjoy. And, you know, so it's kind of crazy contradiction. So Italy, very important. Now, with all due respect to Matthew and to Ettore, we're now going to move on to the heavy gun. We have Bob Adam, and he doesn't need any introduction to probably 99% of people here, having founded TAG in the first place, and INTBAU, and has done so many other things. Of course, Adam Architecture has set up Adam Architecture, which is now by substantial margin, the biggest practice in the country, some 160 employees, and he's extremely vigorous in all departments: research, writing, combating the RIBA at all quarters. Sorry if there's any RIBA people here. We do feel it's a combat sometimes, despite the fact we are supposed to be a linked society. We're not quite sure how they think of that. But anyway, Bob campaigns tirelessly, and I think I'll start repeating myself, so Bob, please stand up and help me out. Take over and look forward to what you're going to say.
I was in, I pressed the button. Yes, that's the title. It kind of begins here, really. I think Matthew's partly pointed this out. I really couldn't resist this quotation. Saint-Just was known as the angel of death. Actually, he heralded the death of tradition. I don't think there's a better quote about what happened in the Enlightenment. And he basically, if he thought something was pernicious, you were likely to lose your head. And we don't go quite that far now. Now, in my opinion, it sort of starts here. So a slightly off-the-wall illustration. This is actually a museum in Edinburgh, and on the top is a 1960s room, and at the bottom is a 1930s room. Well, I was a student in the 1960s, so I was mid-60s. I was very active in things that were going on in London, and I never saw a room like this in my life. I did show the other one to my parents before they died in the 1930s, and they'd never seen a room like this in their life either. The whole point about this is that if you study history, I think Matthew's already made this point, and we're going to repeat one another all the time, is that if you study history, you begin to believe that the thing that defines an era is only those things that are unique to that era. Once you get that idea in your head of its time, or truthful to its time, means it must be made up of things that are only unique to that period. And that is the core problem. I'll rather paraphrase Peter Brundle-Jones, who wrote one of the definitions of why we objected to this kind of thing. But given the fact that none of us actually knew any rooms like this, perhaps this does suggest a life that was never lived. A false history does violence to the memory and devalues the historic examples it copies. So I think understanding how this historical process leads to that, I think, is very important. Basically what we're dealing with a history theory. I'm going to repeat one other again and again on these. It's so easy to find these examples of, shock horrors. But I think the one on the bottom right is probably more relevant. This is the kind of stuff that we come across every day in practice, is that we are expected, and I will quote one or two planning policies now, we must not create development which awkwardly reflects the past. That's Doncaster local plan, or Milton Keynes. The council will not support design where it simply tries to repeat design and an appearance from a different era. This is the kind of stuff we have, this is the kind of bureaucratic stuff that we have to deal with. I think we've already had an illustration of the kind of thing. And a number of it, if I'm asked for a glass link again, I think I shall leap across the table and throttle the planning officer that asked me to do it. But, we struggle with the issue of authenticity all the time. Parthenon again, which was the authentic reconstruction of the Parthenon? Well, of course, discovering it was all rather brightly coloured was something of a shock. And then we get, of course, to neoclassicism. So, of course, all of them trying one way or another to produce something that was authentically ancient Greek. And we now regard this as actually a typical example of the late 18th, early 19th century. Although actually the Nashville Parthenon, at the top right, which was built in 1897, fell down and rebuilt again in 1920. So I'm not quite sure what that is authentic of. It's authentic of late 19th century or early 20th century. And of course, they'd found out about colour by that time. And we can go on, really, and on. So does this Doric represent? And here we have Clarendon building from the 18th century, Schinkel from the 19th century, bottom right, the Warsaw Palace of Culture and Science in the 20th century, and just to cap it off, one of my own buildings in the 21st century. So these are all authentic expressions of each one of these centuries, or particular attitude in each one of these centuries. And of course, we don't have to limit ourselves to classicism. Here we have St. Petrus in Paulskirk in Ostend, which is 1899 to 1908. And then we have Beauvais Cathedral at the bottom. I just picked two which were roughly similar. I think a number of people have already made this point, so I don't want to labour it too much, because this happened a lot. I think Ettore spoke about Valadier. This is my favourite, really. This is Piranesi's record of the Arch of Titus, and this is Valadier's reconstruction, which actually took the whole thing down and started again. Now, do all those tourists that come to Rome think this is the Arch of Titus? Well, they probably do. Does it matter? No, not really. If they really want to find out, they can. If they are a scholar and are interested, they can find out. But so now, of course, this is an absolutely authentic example of attitudes to conservation in 1821. So. And I mean, this always comes out. This is a reconstruction of Warsaw from 1955. It roughly finished. Interesting enough, when it was made the World Heritage Site, she was called authentic. It was called authentic as a finished concept of post-war reconstruction. In other words, don't do it again. We'll just give you we'll give you this one. And then there's Williamsburg now. I'm sure the redcoats marching on the bottom left are not authentic. In fact, if you look at the photograph on the top left, Williamsburg was quite a sort of normal sort of East Coast town. But in the 1930s, they decided to turn it into a symbol of the founding of America. They didn't have much to go on, actually. They had these Bodleian prints and a little bit of archaeology. But they made something which actually symbolizes and is very, very important to the concept of the European, if you like, or the British foundation of the United States. Now, I wonder how many visitors to the United States who, on the whole, don't have a huge grasp of historical context, actually go along there and say, well, actually, this is all a fake. I'm just going to ignore it. And those aren't really red coats. And they have a man, they pay a man to ride up and down a horse on a tricorn hat, just to sort of generally give the feel. Does it matter? Not really. And of course, we're not alone in this. Of course, what we have here is a fake of the Barcelona Pavilion, built 50 years later. An interesting point about this, and note the Ionic columns which rather framed it, which don't get reproduced, of course. But, of course, this is a genuine or authentic record of attitudes in the 1970s and 80s towards Mies van der Rohe. If no one had been interested in Mies van der Rohe, they wouldn't have done it. So this is actually, in its own way, a completely authentic record of that adulation of this particular architect. And just to make the point, you just keep on copying it in various forms. It's just fine. And in fact, if you want to win an architectural award, this is the way to do it. Design something like a shoebox and cover it in glass, and you'll get an award. The top left actually got a World Architecture Award. The bottom right actually is a listed building. This goes on, really. The idea somehow that this level of influence and so on is pernicious. I mean, obviously it's not. We have here actually a building in Ho Chi Minh City on the top left, which is pretty clearly influenced by the Gropius's work for the Bauhaus, or Mest Town in Copenhagen, clearly, like many buildings, clearly influenced by Mies van der Rohe's project for Berlin. So I think the key to understanding all of this, after all, this is the traditional architecture group, is understanding what tradition is itself. I do bang on about this rather a lot, because I actually think this is rather important. I mean, tradition is something where actually you do deliberately repeat the past in some way or another in order to connect yourself with your culture, your family, or something of this nature, and generally takes place at important events. And here we have my son getting married and various other people getting married. Each country has its own particular aspects of this, and these ceremonies last longer than language, actually, for immigrant communities. So tradition is very important. And I think this is part of the point that Ettore made, is that these are the things by which we signify our culture. Now, I think we have to I think the key to this, again, is to understand the nature of tradition. We do this all the time. So the key thing about tradition is tradition is not the past. Tradition carries on, and you can invent it and you can add to it. This is a whole subject on its own. These three gentlemen on the right who are about to play havoc with the Tartan army somewhere in Paris are wearing a form of dress which was made up in the early 19th century. I mean, it had an historic origin, and that's the important point. It did have a direct connection with history. And so you can actually modify it and change it, and so on. The Tolpuddle Martyrs Parade was only started in the 1930s. They weren't called martyrs until the early 20th century. And they were actually, the actual event, the martyrdom, was in 1834. And this is now a really important ceremony for unionism. I'm not criticizing it for that for one moment. This is perfectly reasonable. They've attached themselves to an historic event. They've modified it and made most of it. The bottom left is the Chupinazo at the Festival of San Fermin in Pamplona. The Festival of San Fermin, the bull run, originates somewhere in the 14th to 15th century. But the Chupinazo was actually introduced in 1941, which is fireworks and balloons and so on and so on. So you can just add to traditions. You can keep on going. And my favorite for these two rather smug people standing on the bottom right are judges in the European Court of Human Rights, 1951. Now, notice they're wearing 17th century clerical wear, or a version of it, which clearly no one was wearing in 1951. But the point about that is that they have attached themselves to a well-established European tradition where judges wear clerical wear dating from the 16th and 17th century. So, they're not smiling at the ridiculousness of their clothing. They're smiling because they're rather important people, and their authority is actually signaled by the taking on of that tradition. So if we can understand that you can keep on developing traditions But the point is that they're also extremely important, because without our traditions, we lose our identity. Finally, just as a sort of sweetener, now these are two buildings which must be, Article 12, must be distinguishable from the original. Well, they are actually. The top one is by George Samuel Smith, a rather sort of Sonian introduction into an earlier building, and the bottom one is the building on the left is one I designed, which is also sort of vaguely distinguishable. So does it matter that actually that one looks like an early 19th century one and one looks like a sort of 17th century? No, it doesn't. Actually, it's interesting enough. The good thing about this, of course, is that in both cases, we actually both George and I came across conservation officers who really didn't care. But it's a terrible tragedy that we have to come across bureaucrats who take a particular view as a contrary to those planning policies that I quoted earlier. So I'll finish off because, you know, it was always nice to show your own stuff. With three versions of the same thing which I designed. One is pretty straightforward, although it's got a model of the World Cup on the top of it because my client was a footballer. The next one is actually Kremlin. It's a temple of love for some Russians, but it's not really altogether authentic. And the other one, the final one, is definitely authentically the turn of the 20th century because you couldn't have built it any other time. But they're all authentic. It doesn't matter. If you build something now, you can't avoid but be authentic. If we imagine we are a historian 100 years hence, and we look back on now, and we actually look at what's happening, clearly what we're all doing in this room is one of the things that's happening. So it has to be authentic. So thank you very much.
It's highly reassuring to know we're authentic, and hopefully that we exist. We have a problem in that we have so much happening that we're contracting. So in order so that the second panel can proceed, and then we can, have a discussion after that, and then move on to socialize, which after all, a lot of us are just waiting for. I'm going to compact the discussion down to, say, 15 minutes max, and I'm afraid that's just going to have to be the way it is. So I would like to maybe put a couple of people on the spot. In fact, a couple of gentlemen sitting right over there together. Maybe, Nikos, I could start with you. Now, Nikos Kouridis is one of these people. There are others that we would have liked to have among the speakers, but then we just had too many speakers for our time allotted because we're still trying to do a mini symposium and not a whole day event. So we would have had Nikos Kouridis up here speaking, but we now have him in the third row. Now, Nikos Kouridis is, apart from, if I can say this, the benefit of having been my PhD student, which of course explains his great height. But apart from that, he is a master in the subject of conservation, history, and architecture, and he's teaching, I would say, leading the, you'll have to give me the official thing, but Nikos may give you the actual complete details, but the University of Kent, he is Mr. Conservation of Buildings and Heritage and Urbanism person. Off you go, Nikos.
Thank you very much, Mark, and wonderful presentations, very, very inspiring. They open a lot of topics. I just want to highlight some from my own perspective as the founding director of the conservation program in the University of Kent. So we are one of the few programs that actually teach restoration as well as conservation of historic buildings. And during the 13 years that our program has been running, we've experimented with many approaches to this, and we've engaged with these problems in the legislation. It's interesting to add, perhaps, what has happened since the Venice Charter, that I think the conservation movement is more of an ally than we might think. And that, for instance, the World Heritage Convention, through its inclusion of essentially constructed sites in the World Heritage List, has actually perhaps departed from part of the dogmaticism that is illustrated in the Venice Charter, and showed that restoration and reconstruction, even reconstruction, is a legitimate course of action. It's not just Warsaw. There are significant sites. We could mention Fez, we could mention the medieval city of Rhodes, but there are so many other products of reconstruction that are now considered part of World Heritage. I think conservation, for this reason, the conservation movement and UNESCO, is an ally, and I think it has done more good than harm in trying to make sure that reconstruction is carried out with caution. The reason is that there is the architectural reality, but there's also the archaeological reality of buildings. We are very much aware of it as architectural historians, buildings preserving incredible evidence that sometimes it's very difficult to obtain or to read. So a hasty reconstruction representing the knowledge of a certain period of time might actually lead to the loss of that heritage. So this call for caution, I think, in the legislation and in the Historic England guidance, in the document that Georgia mentioned to me, actually is welcome. And the call that reconstruction should be accompanied by careful documentation is very, very sensible rule. This is a project, therefore, a reconstruction that should engage with architectural historians, with anthropologists, with all the disciplines that can help us understand heritage. And it promotes this understanding. So I think this caution, yes, it's a problem for traditional architects, but it's one that can be overcome and can lead to increased quality results. You have to prove yourself. So you need to think twice about what you're doing. And you need to conserve as well as complete. So it's a very interesting challenge. I'm not sure about the definition of the gap. I think it's as vague as the concept of authenticity. If the gap is between a time before conservation, where buildings developed more organically, and the time afterwards where contrasts started to happen, we have examples, I think, of destruction and gaps before conservation. I think that what brings us to the current situation is, if I was to generalize, is a view of buildings that is based on two misconceptions. One is the isolated view of buildings outside their context. So we tend to preserve individual units. We write conservation plans for individual buildings, not so much about cities. Sometimes these buildings form part of a broader project. And the other is our static view of these buildings. We like to see them as products of a specific time. And in a vast percentage, vast majority of buildings, they used to be a living organism, or they were for most of their lifetime a living organism, an ongoing project. And I think some of the speakers saw fantastic examples of that, Palazzo Chiericati, but so many others. I think that if we see buildings dynamically, and if we see them in context, then this opens the door to an alternative approach to reconstruction, in that you're not reconstructing something that existed at one point in time, but you continue a project. And this is an attitude very similar to that of Viollet-le-Duc, who actually brought projects to completion, even though they may never have attained that completion before. So I think we have a lot to learn from that. And indeed, this is very much what is happening in our great monuments. Look at Canterbury Cathedral, where new structures are introduced to it, continuing the project. And reconstruction is practiced widely, but it's very well documented and very well substantiated. So I think my view of what happened after the Venice Charter is a little bit more positive than one might expect. I think it has introduced interesting criteria for reconstruction projects, and the result we see in several reconstruction projects around the country. All our great cathedrals are built like that. We have great reconstruction projects in the past celebrated as part of the World Heritage List. So I think this is something we should, as traditional architects, we should really engage with and use as a very valid instrument. It is working for us as long as we can make the right case for it.
Right, no, thank you very much, Nikos. And I think there are, I mean, we are probably presenting with this gap thing, maybe a sort of didactic, drastic picture, but of course, yeah, there are encouraging things happening after the Venice Charter, and the book Venice Charter Revisited is an example of that. And I think also, I think we can say also that while we're obviously concentrating on sort of Europe, UK, Europe, maybe the States, of course, there is this global contribution to the debate because you have the phenomenon, say, in Japanese, Chinese temples where there's constant reconstruction. And so, you know, at some point, the building that you're enshrining as sacred and holy and is not actually anything ancient left at all. And even that is, the ancient Greeks already had that idea in mind when debating the problem of the boat of the ship of Theseus, because it was constantly being restored because they didn't want it to decay. And then at some point they had this already in ancient Greece, the debate about the boat that was actually no bit of it was actually Theseus's anymore, and yet it was Theseus's. So we need more capacity for engaging with paradoxes. So no, thank you very much, Nikos. And can I ask if there are any, whether it's Nikos or someone else who tutors maybe in an architecture school, I'm also looking to Harry, in terms of not so much the restoring of monuments, but the new additions too, because we've seen, you know, the Liebeskind examples. I mean, it's even two stylistically similar, sharp, pointy things, one in Dresden, one in Ottawa or wherever it was, I forget. But, you know, we've seen these sort of ridiculous attempts at contrast and discontinuity and rupture. And I just wondered whether actually in design studio there's some movement in, let's say, lowering the temperature of these contrasts. If anyone can comment on that in the current situation.
Mark, in the meanwhile, can I add something on what Nikos was saying?
You are a speaker.
No, because many times we are thinking at this problem too much theoretically, but practically it's a serious problem. A serious problem because, of course, there are different interpretations, but there is also the problem that now I'm talking about as an Italian architect that works in restoration, we are dealing with people that are working in the Sovrintendenza that are using the document as a dogma without thinking according to the way they were thought about that. And so, as the AI, it is a plagiary of, is making quotation of, and then make the plagio. Those that are working there are working as natural stupidity, because at the end they have one version and they don't care. We are obliged to create a lot of documents. We have to make a philological reconstruction. We have to study in the archive. We have to make a survey. We have to analyze everything. But then the final word is the one of the responsible of the district, the building we are restoring, that impose kind of rules like those of the Athens Charter. The Venice Charter, and they forbid anything that is, not everybody obviously, but they forbid to do anything that is mimetically working in recreating exactly what it was.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Sorry. No, I think you highlight the complexity and paradoxes of the whole process. I mean, we decide to make something into a ruin because we think ruins are okay. They didn't think ruins were okay in the Middle Ages. They just thought they were useful things, sources of stone. A number of just very brief comments. One is, the greatest change you can make is no change, because everything changes. And the other thing about understanding is understanding by whom? Is it by ordinary people, pejorative term? Is it by the general public, or is it just by specialists? So there clearly is a paradox in all of these things, and we are going to be confronted with this paradox again and again, with trying to introduce sustainable measures to currently in use buildings. And in my view, the issue with that is to understand that they are going to change, but they can change in a way that is sympathetic to their history.
Yeah, the problem is that, as I noted, the documents were intended as guidance and have been taken as holy writ, a point which one of the authors, who was surviving author of the US Secretary of the Interior's Standards for Historic Preservation, made, that they had no idea that their words would be taken so literally, and that they had intended to start a conversation in which people would intelligently continue the story of buildings, and ended up with, dogmatic people making instant judgments, from a point of ignorance, I guess. Maybe that's the fate, as Alan Blum suggests, the fate of all charters, is to become written in stone.
On the subject of charters, isn't it a bit like all planning law? All planning law, that it becomes dogma because it's in a process where you're often debating with people what they cannot do with their property, which has economic values. There's a whole political context for, which I remember when I was reading law years ago, I used to call the backs to the wall mentality. So you get the worst interpretation of the policy or the charter or whatever it is, because it's just the one that people have fought right to the barricades about over somebody intervening with somebody's property right. I know it sounds a bit of an odd and rather sort of sad view, but I think there's something in that.
Yeah.
I was just taking on your point about lowering the temperature, about the contrast against historic buildings. I'm a conservation architect, and I precisely had that case in one of my projects, an extension to a Grade 1 listed building in a town in Norfolk, where we had these two views, one from some part of the public saying, why are you doing something that is so contrasting to the existing building, which is flint? And the other side that was saying, yeah, we completely agree with your view about presenting a new thing that is contrasting to the existing building. But to me, really, the whole point is not about contrasting for the sake of contrasting. I think is having a real understanding of the existing building and the context, and then a response to that. And one of the things that we discussed with Historic England at the time, with the conservation officer, was precisely that, because they were saying things like, oh, you need to pick up on the slope of the existing roof and replicate that in your building, in your little extension. But then there was another little extension made to that original building, built in the 18th century, which had a different pitch in the roof. And I was actually taking up the cues from that one for my extension. Anyway, it took a long time to get through all of that, but I think, to me, is really a complete understanding of what you're dealing with, the history of the place, how it has evolved, and the context in which it's sitting, and looking at the next at least 100 years of what is going to happen with that building, with that extension, and what is going to happen with the Grade 1 16th century building. Because I think the problem with all these other contrasting buildings that we've been shown just now is that they age very quickly, especially the ones that were built in the 80s. You can't tell exactly that they were built in the 80s. You look, in Cambridge University, many of those buildings built in the 1980s, I mean, they have aged badly, really. But it's just a case now that we need to look at not just the architectural style of the new intervention, but also the sustainability of it, the materials that we're using, and how it is actually working with the existing and being working in tangent with the existing building.
No, thank you, absolutely. And I mean, the points about the documentation and the care doing and the interaction, and then, I mean, the point about sustainability and the problems with modern construction. I mean, Ettere's examples also of these buildings that just collapsed because they're not, ironically, I think for the general public, because they would assume that modern technology is going to be superior, and you find the old structures standing there, maybe with some problems and some cracks and some shifts, but they're sort of wobbling around, whereas the structures that are inflexible, they stay there up to a certain point and then collapse. So yeah, thank you for that point.
A couple of points, just following on Jeremy. One of the things that came out of the Venice Charter Revisited was I call the Talmud and Torah issue, is that it was pretty much accepted that the Venice Charter was not going to be changed. It had taken on the role of the Bible. And what we need, in fact, what you're seeing from there on in, is a constant reinterpretation and clarification, which I think Ettore has highlighted another. I just might mention one other point. Beware of saying you're doing something for the next century. I'm old enough to have spoken to people who were around in 1925, and their attitude to these things was utterly different. We can only act on what we think now. I worry a great deal about people saying, I'm doing this for 100 years. One thing we do know about the future is we don't know what it is. And we can only act on information and attitudes that we have now.
Yeah, no, but I think the point was that you're trying to use materials that hopefully will be easy to maintain, or relatively easy to maintain, and will progress.
No, I've got that. It's what I'm really saying is that our attitudes, which we believe are right, and that's why we're all here, and that's why we're talking about it, won't necessarily be believed to be right in 100 years.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
I think I can have much more enemies after saying this, but honestly, I don't care. Because as I said, the vocabulary is absolutely clear in explaining what does it mean to restore. And what does it mean? Means that the architect himself, responsible of the restoration, doesn't have to appear at all, because this is the reconstruction, the restoration of the monument, is not the signature of the latest architect that is touching the buildings. But I would like to stress some other point, because as I said during my presentation, we are architects of restoration, expert of static, expert of behavior of wall, of materials, technical construction, etc. But we are depending on rules that are mainly decided by art historians that I define historicists, not historians, that wants to impose their point of view without having any idea of the way walls, vaults, roofs, bricks, stones are performing. And we are damaging the buildings because we want to do something that belongs to the 21st century without thinking that that could damage the building, as I shown in these images. So the needs of rewriting the Venice Charter is also to be extremely clear, clarifying what must be the role of the architect, clarifying what must be the kind of architects, because in Italy, even if it is now, because of globalization, because of European community, no longer used, is written that on an historical building, the restoration could be done only by an architect that has made specific studies for the restoration. But now we have people that are coming from other countries with the knowledge that is debatable, which are putting their signature of the building. For instance, I don't know how many of you have visited the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, restored by Rem Koolhaas. That is raping the building, is not restoring the building. So we can be extremely clear saying whoever has no interest for the monument but is always trying to put his signature on a building has to make a different job. Historical buildings must be treated only by those that know how to treat. I'm not going to have some operation on my art to a dentist.
Okay, good, a good analogy, right?
If I could just add to that, I think the kind of proof of the pudding here is that the planning and heritage officers, kindly souls, get so hung up about additions. Now, I think they have a right to comment on restoration of buildings in which they're expert and which are covered by the charters, but everybody knows from the presentations, and no doubt from the ones who have that, people get terribly hung up about what you're adding on to an existing building, and frankly, it doesn't matter. You can demolish it in the future, as long as it doesn't damage the existing building beyond repair. If you want to add a glass box, if you want to add a replica and butterfly it, why does that matter so much to conservationists? Conservation is concerned with existing building, not with extensions. That's contemporary practice. And as we know, contemporary practice is diverse, is varied. It can't be creating a charter for what is permissible in the present day is just an exercise in ludicrous fantasy. And that's, I fear, where the good intentions of conservation have led us.
Okay, we are ready to start the second panel now. And the second panel will explore successful reconstruction precedents in the UK and sensitive interventions in the historic fabric, emphasizing continuity rather than contrast and reinforcing the narrative of place. The topic of reconstruction of listed buildings of national and international importance have been damaged by catastrophic events remains still a subject of active debate, particularly in the light of the values discussed in the first panel. I know Nikos had a very optimist view on this, but particular cases that we are dealing with daily maybe show something different in practice. In recent years, we have witnessed the completion of several reconstruction projects around the world. Those efforts extend beyond urban scale interventions to include individual, iconic buildings. Cases where conservation discourse becomes especially delicate. I would like to mention here the reconstruction works in Paris, Notre Dame as we saw, Potsdam, where the entire center was rebuilt, and several particular buildings were partially rebuilt, some totally rebuilt. Berlin, Budapest, so many other places. Such reconstruction hold profound meaning for the public. Beyond theoretical debates about material authenticity and conceptual purity, as Ettore highlighted in this presentation, they ultimately serve a deeper purpose, the restoration and rebuilding of identity. So with this said, I would like to invite now the first speaker of the second section, Jeremy Masson, an architectural historian, consultant, and educator, chair of the Historical Houses Foundation. So welcome, Jeremy Masson.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction and very helpful sort of philosophical placing. Old architecture is not dead architecture. Old architecture lives and breathes, and for it to live, it needs constant love, attention, regeneration. And often this is not fully understood until there is a period of great crisis, or perhaps until something really special is being built anew in the same tradition. In this short paper, I will touch on the justification for restoration, the significance of a number of major post-fire reconstructions of historic buildings in the UK that sort of have shaped my professional sort of topography of my career, because they've always been in the background, and they'll be familiar to you as well, but interesting to revisit them and think about them, if only briefly. And throughout, I'm trying to think of their heritage significance as restored heritage buildings, and also the relationship that the skills have to the significance of those heritage buildings in their reconstructed form. I have to say in advance, it will be a rather personal and idiosyncratic view of somebody who has travelled through English historic architecture, wearing a number of different hats and disguises, as a historian, as a consultant, as a curator, and so on. Central to this big topic, I think, is the question of how contemporary traditional architectural practice helps sustain those important skills, and the significance of the skills in themselves for the wider community, both as heritage skills and sustaining the life of those skills in their own right, as a principle. So the aesthetic and communal values identified in official guidance for heritage significance in historic architecture might also be, perhaps, embedded in the skills which are necessary to preserve them. It's the activity, it's the doing and making. Sorry, that was supposed to be with that slide, but never mind, we'll move on to the other one. Every year in Cambridge, where I do a bit of teaching and echoing Ettore's wonderful talk, as it happens, I give a regular lecture to students on the changing story of ruins in European culture, how they are seen, how they are valued and presented, how they are defined by being preserved as ruins. It's not necessarily the state of ruins that makes them culturally important, but it's the decision to preserve them in that ruined state. And at the end of the lecture, I always end with a discussion about how this protection of the unbuilding, the ruin, has shaped conservation thinking, peculiar sort of historic progress from protecting the ruin to protecting the inhabited and useful house, if you like, and institution. And we always end, right at the end of the debate, we have a really rip-roaring debate. At the end of the lecture, we always have a big argument with the students about issues such as wartime destruction. You have the Royal Castle at Warsaw damaged over the course of the Second World War and totally flattened in 1944. And it's a prime example of one, as Ettore was saying, that is rebuilt for obvious cultural imperatives. And it's interesting in that debate, I find those students who come from architectural schools stick very doggedly to the idea that it cannot be rebuilt. But they are not in the majority, I would say. And over the years, I notice a slightly different. Yes, I repeat the lecture every year for years. But it always has to change, because our thinking is changing and their responses is changing. So I do think this, and as you know, the restoration of the Royal Castle at Warsaw came even later than the old city that we've seen once or twice in other lectures. It wasn't until 1971 they began the reconstruction and finished only in 1984. So it brings that whole story of recovery right up into our lives. And there are many, many more of these over Europe, many more than people realize. I've suggested a book on this subject so many times, but it hasn't found favour yet. So we all need these traditional skills of stonemasonry, bricklaying, carpentry, leadwork to preserve the great buildings of the past and to sustain their authentic qualities, even when this means a very highly principled, well-recorded, well-researched approach to the restoration and indeed the new elements that are added. And of course, there are many, many examples of such palaces, public buildings and cathedrals built after wartime destruction, and they give significant evidence, again, of the cultural value, not just of the buildings themselves, but of the materials and skills that make them. And of course, the responses to the sharper awareness of heritage that emerge from such dramatic loss, although I think one of the speakers was implying that this was also a period, I think it was Matthew, that this was also a period when people took it as an inspiration to abandon their sense of heritage and encompass the possibilities of change that it offered. But the cultural imperative restitution needs the real physical and human response from skilled craftsmen. This is how buildings are healed from wartime damage. So I thought it equally relevant to look at some of the best-known peacetime projects, which, as I say, shaped my sort of cultural topography as somebody working in historic buildings: Hampton Court, Up and Windsor Castle, each restored after devastating fires. And I know some of you probably involved in them, for all I know, in this room. And each relied on craft skills, uniquely essential. And each project also became a sort of instant school of craft. They were places where people learnt the crafts and went out to work on other restorations and on other new buildings. Interesting enough, I was debating this topic with a philosopher in Cambridge, and he said you might be interested in the complex but intriguing arguments of the Canadian philosopher Dominic Lopez. Are any of you familiar with him? I thought Nikos might. Being for Beauty, where he essentially argues that aesthetics is all about these participatory practices rather than just about the contemplation and judgment of works of art. So for my purposes, if the aesthetic and communal values of historic buildings include the materials and the crafts which form them, and 2, that are necessary to their restoration and repair, and 3, that are part of the process of preserving the aesthetic value of the building, then doesn't it also reside in the artisans and those skills themselves? I'm, of course, not arguing that all traditional buildings, modern traditional buildings, immediately qualify for historic significance, but the special regard should be had to the value of the craft traditions they help sustain. A simple conclusion from some of this discussion and investigation was that the knowledge embedded in those historical buildings, which is used to conceive of and design the new additions to old buildings in a sympathetic way, the spirit of fitting in and enhancing the old, and to inform new traditional architecture as well, can share directly in that significant, in those embodied values. It was very interesting to hear Matthew talking about the Venice Charter and the INTBAU Declaration of 2007, because I came from, as it were, my own experiences to revisit this recently in preparing for this talk. And I was rather sort of fascinated by how very clear and compelling the INTBAU Declaration is. You'll all know it, I'm sure. Article 9. New work must be distinct from the original composition and must bear a contemporary stamp. INTBAU offer a different response, but this goal must be dynamically balanced with other needs, including the need for coherent and enduring environments, human environments. Thus, new work may be distinct from the original composition while still harmonizing with that composition. A contemporary stamp may be provided in a number of ways, including interpretive information or identifying marks or characteristics. It is not necessary to create a striking juxtaposition which may violate the mandate to preserve the traditional setting or relation of mass and colour. I couldn't agree more. And I'm interested to know, perhaps, and we might discuss it later, how much the declaration has percolated to the architecture school and to the conservation officer training. Perhaps Sean would have an opinion on that, because it's not something I hear very much coming back to me in those debates. I often, curiously, it's rather wonderful to be in the Art Workers Guild, isn't it, which had such a strong relationship with the Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings, it's been mentioned, and I often reflect, particularly in my country life work, looking at early 20th century restorations of manor houses, which were almost the sort of English ideal. Mark Giroud, he says, what is the perfect English country house for 1910? He says, it is a lovingly restored manor house. Could well have been restored by an SBAB-trained member of the Art Workers Guild. And what's interesting about those is that they are always very beautiful. The repairs and the extensions are done tactfully, differently, but elegantly and beautiful. The beautiful sort of compositional response. And this is, of course, I think, what drove Morris and what drove Ruskin. I know they had their strong opinions about honesty, but that could be achieved in those early 1900 years by people working in the same skills and the same materials. In heritage assessments, I also work with leading conservation architects, and it's very interesting, of course, to make regular reference to the English heritage conservation principles, policies, and guidance, which focus on heritage significance, aesthetic value, and communal value, which, as I was arguing before, I think belong not just in the buildings and the materials, but in the embodied buildings. So I was going to look quickly at some of those key buildings, and I probably run out of time, but I hope I've given you an impression of what my thoughts are on this big topic. And I found myself often asking with these projects, have they lost their value that they had before the fire? Have they restored the same significance values that they had, heritage significance, and those different values that make up heritage significance? Are they fully restored, or are they something different? And does it matter? Well, perhaps it does matter for how we understand and engage with it and interpret them when they are great public buildings. The 1986 Hampton Court Palace, extensive damage, particularly to the state apartments by Wren. Devastating, and took 5 or 6 years, I think, to restore. But it became the platform for representing the fine quality of the Wren interiors, which had been somewhat lost in later treatments. And all the craftspeople involved, builders, carvers, textile conservators, became an important part not just of the doing, but the thinking about it. So David Esterly, the great carver, helped influence the approach. Up-Ark we've mentioned, which I glanced over there. I myself worked for the National Trust, and this was all the time I worked for the National Trust, this was being restored and had its own very particular story in the heritage world. And in fact, when I came to revise this area for the Sussex West Buildings of England, Pevsner, I made its restoration a key part of its significance for a reader or somebody encountering architecture should be able to visit this and appreciate that it is a beautifully reconstructed thing where the skills that were available were essential to that rescue, and it became, just as I mentioned with Hampton Court, it became an essential school of craft. These projects which everyone, it's a little bit like the soldiers who we send out to war, we never think about them until we send them out to war, and then we're very grateful for them. Same, I think, with the great skilled craftspeople. So I can tell that I'm being winked at because I've used up too much of my time. So Windsor Castle will have to leave, but you get the impression, I think, of the story. So as it happens, the other side of my work is working a lot with contemporary architects working in traditional styles. And amazingly, I think you've already seen some of those slides already today. And it was an enormous privilege for me to write this book on the Adam architecture about 10 years ago, I think, and to travel UK, visiting these buildings, seeing the different impact of traditional craft skills in practice. And I was rather pleased when I asked a very modernist friend what he thought about this book. And he said, well, it's very interesting to see the different applications of traditional crafts in practice. That was his one-line response to my book. I don't think he liked the architecture very much. Sorry, Bob. But it was a real privilege to work on this, to see so many things at one time, that the practice had evolved over 20 years, these particular houses. I know the practice is a lot older, but to then bring them into one container, as it were. And then also writing for Country Life on Kilboy was one of the greatest expressions, I think, of the great skills of the craftsmen in the modern world, and one of the greatest buildings that I have seen. Since then, so we've got stonework by Ketton Stone and plasterwork by Locker and Riley. And since that time, I've been to those workshops, and I feel that I'm in the presence. It's like I've walked into the corner of one of those Gandhi renderings of a great project by Soane, and you find yourselves amongst the craft skills, the stonemasons, the plasterers, and you realize how much of that living craft is really what's going to make the interesting building. As you know, the rather sort of curious back history of Kilboy is it was a rebuilding of a lost house, but nonetheless, much of it was reimagined in this remarkable creation. So, to conclude, I will leave you with another question, if I may. If old buildings are considered imbued with multiple messages from the past, historic buildings of note are the monuments of earlier generations and remain to the present day as living witnesses to age-old tradition, I just ask you again, isn't it the skills that make them so, that are being witnessed, and the age-old traditions of making which are being celebrated and which need to be cherished and protected and encouraged? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for this wonderful presentation. Sorry that I hurried you up so much. I think this is very optimistic to see so many reconstruction works after fires, devastating fires, and we only hope to see more accomplishment like this. The next speaker will delight us with a delicious presentation. Let's welcome Francis Terry. Francis is a well-known representative of new classical architecture, a former TAG chair who designed numerous new contextual interventions in the existing historic fabric, iconic new country houses, author of several counter-proposals in urban settings promoting sensitive interventions, and very much in continuity with the historical settings. Welcome, Francis.
Thank you. Always hard to follow Jeremy Musson's erudite presentations. We'll just have to adjust your level of expectation. Yeah, I titled this Let Them Eat Cake because what I find, I guess it's the Venice Charter, but really the whole legislation around modernism, it's so joyless and taking architects out of the equation. People want to see these buildings. They don't want to see half a building and then their imagination has to imagine the rest. They want to see these things. And I think it's part of a wider, just very joyless attitude to beauty that sort of came around in the early 20th century. I mean, this is the sort of painting that people were doing in the 18th century, and it's full of excitement, love, enthusiasm, love of life, and you see this in Edwardian painting as well, and that people look their best, and this is, you know, that mankind is a sort of wonderful, beautiful, optimistic species, but with good reason. in the early 20th century, with the terrible effects of the First World War, people were kind of looking around for what had caused this terrible event, and they very much threw the baby out with the bathwater and blamed all of tradition. And unfortunately, this is the result, is completely sort of joyless painting that's clumsy, ugly, discordant. And I think in a way it's a pity in a way that architecture is sort of bound up was seen as an art, because I think that really with a painting, you can go to an art gallery, or you don't have to. No one has to see it the whole time. And likewise, a novel can be depressing but very gripping, and you don't have to have it. But the trouble with architecture, it's for everyone the whole time, and that's a very different brief. Yeah, that's another thing they're saying. And you know, I sort of slightly despair about this kind of depressing world that we're making for ourselves. You've obviously seen many pictures like this, and this is what our towns look like. And what I feel that we've lost is a feeling of joy in architecture, that things should be lovable, that things should be sort of memorable. And ornament and colour, and also this is from Lille in northern France. And I feel that what's wonderful about these sort of buildings is that they're of their place, and that people can feel that this is their town. You know, they can travel all around the world and they come back to Lille, and it's through buildings like this that has a kind of shared love. And another aspect to buildings, which I think is a good acid test of a good historic centre, is it sketchable? And that is both the building that you're looking at worth sketching, and also is the context that you're sitting in, is that a nice context to be in? And these are very much mine and my father's thoughts when we were working on Queen Mother Square in Poundbury. And I think what's wonderful about Poundbury, and it has many critics, is that so many of these traditional lessons we were just allowed to kind of explore with exuberance. And I think classical architecture in itself is such a human style of building. If you think of a column has a head, and the shaft is the body, and then the base is its feet. And also, I feel, I was just thinking on the train on the way here, that when you buy a ticket for a train, you say hello to the person in the ticket office. You just say where you're going. They have a bit of a chat about different prices, and then you say goodbye and hope to see you soon, or whatever. And I think that's the same with the classical column. It's not just the weight, it's the beginning, it's the hello with a capital, and it's the goodbye with the base. So everything has a kind of politeness to it. And I mean, sort of going on from another one of Poundbury, is that it's a setting where you can be, where you can sketch. And I think that, you know, we're all travelling around the world the whole time, but we're not making places where you can be. And I feel that traditional architecture makes those settings where you can feel sort of whole at one. Another intervention, this time into a genuinely historic setting, was the building that me and my father did on Tottenham Court Road, the junction of Tottenham Court Road and Oxford Street. And this building, no one notices. It created no stir. People weren't shocked by it. And in a way, that's slightly disappointing, because it's a two superimposed double height orders, Corinthian Ionic, with a rusticated base. I mean, it's pretty strong meat, but it follows the style of the sort of Oxford Street early 20th century buildings, and it just sort of melts in. And this would be very much my approach. I mean, we were doing something which is early 20th century in character. Another scheme which I got involved in, sadly it's not going to be built, was Orchard House on Oxford Street. And this very beautiful 19th century building was going to be knocked down by Marks and Spencer's because they own the red building to the left, and they wanted to make a whole building and smash down the whole lot and rationalise it, which seems such a pity. I mean, Orchard House is a very beautiful building. I'm sure everyone, probably apart from architects, like it. This is what they propose in its place. And this people would notice for all the wrong reasons. And it's staggering, really. And so anyway, I paired up with my friend Nicholas Boyd-Smith, and so we did a scheme which kept Orchard House and just extended the same language down Oxford Street, keeping an existing building which still could function. Unfortunately, the bad guys won, and so it didn't happen. But hopefully, with this sort of, rethinking the Venice Charter, maybe it will. Just to sort of be a little optimistic, I do think the crafts at the moment in this country are incredible and really helped by modern technology. This is a house I'm doing at the moment. It's a sort of mini Villa Rotunda or a large Temple of the Four Winds, somewhere between the two. And helped by CNC cutters and things like that, which I have absolutely no problem with, you have the most beautiful work coming out. And this is a portico of which there are 4. And there's bead and reel, egg and dart, water leaf, modillions throughout. You couldn't really do that without CNC cutting. Here they are putting this on. Just to round up, I don't know how my timing's going. I have to be way in my time, which is probably good because, okay, good. Another project I've been involved in, which is, I just feel so fortunate to have done this. Castle Howard always has been my favourite house, favourite building. Obviously, I love the book Brideshead Revisited. That, for me, is the Bible. I just love the whole story and the kind of Rex Whistler quality it had. And I got a commission to redo one of the rooms. Castle Howard, like many of these houses, had a devastating fire in the 1940s, and 3/4 of it, I think 2/3 or something was completely burnt out. And there was a room there that effectively looked like this. And the Howards commissioned me not to copy what was there before, although they had photos of it. They just said, do a Baroque room, the kind of room that Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor may have done, because the room that was there was a later version. It was a pretty tame mid-Georgian building. So this was amazing for me. And what was really great about it was they had some tapestries which were commissioned by the Howards who lived there at the time. And they were made for the room in 1706. And we were putting them back in. They were in another room when the fire happened. So that was fantastic to re-put them there. One of my real pleasures from teenage years, actually, is drawing these full-size rendered drawings. And it's something which I sort of do less and less. as I run a practice and have to deal with employing people and things like that. But for this, they wanted to see what the whole thing looked like, and I had a joyful few months drawing like the old days, and they stuck them all up to show the planners exactly what they were getting, which was interesting. Here I am at the site. And this is it all being made, and that's the final result. Funnily enough, my wife, who didn't really pay much attention to this particular project, I sort of slightly hid it from her, and we went to visit it, and she walked into the room, and she kind of thought, when are we going to see Francis's room? So I was extremely happy with that. And I think that will be many people's reaction. And I think that possibly the kind of this debate about the Venice Charter is we're constantly looking at things which are the wrong period, and we don't know and we don't care. Here are some more photos. And what I found particularly wonderful about this project is that it employed craftsmen and women particularly from all over the country, and everything you see in this room, apart from the antiques, was made in England last year, which is incredible. And everyone says, oh, you can't do anything here nowadays, everything gets made in China. And I think that, apart from the kind of aesthetic pleasure, we do have a sort of moral duty to keep these craftsmen going. This is Clooney Fretton, who made this amazing wooden central piece here. Oops, the last one's missing. There, you can see it there. No, it's an absolute joy to see. Okay.
Thank you so much, Francis. It's a delight to see your projects, as always. Your flamboyant creativity and imagination, it's beyond limits. We can confidently say that the cabinet room at Castle Howard can count as future heritage? I think so. How is the feeling of having your name marked in the logbook of Castle Howard along with Hawksmoor? Must be very flattering, I think. The next talk is Richard Ireland. Richard Ireland is an independent consultant for the conservation of historic plaster and paint who worked at the forefront of the groundbreaking restoration of Up Park House in the 90s. Advisor for Historic England, Royal Household, Historic Royal Palaces, Westminster City Council, Office of Public Works, Ireland, National Trust, Historic Scotland, and Ecclesiastical Organisation. Welcome, Richard Ireland. He's coming from the conservation world.
I'm going to be talking just about a couple of materials, 2 plasters. We start with, and it's not really just reinstatement, this is a very general use of the term. This is all about reconstruction and using appropriate materials and how using the wrong ones really completely change both the material authenticity as well as the aesthetic qualities of what you're doing. At Up Park, this is 1994 after the restoration of the Red Drawing Room and the National Trust decision to go ahead with doing the whole thing as it was, that's like for like, that's in freehand modelled lime plaster, was very dramatic. And it's, as Jeremy was saying, it was a school. It was more than that, because these were techniques that hadn't been used for over 150 years. We were having to relearn, research, understand exactly what it meant. So here, this is what it looked like about a year before, all on the floor, various salvaged elements. because it's all hand-modelled, every piece is unique. Unfortunately, we only had about 30% of the ceiling on a photograph, on a plan view. So quite a lot of the material had to be more speculatively put around where we thought it would be. But nonetheless, this was a hugely interesting and useful exercise. This was the miracle span that was made to take the largest of the ceilings, the saloon ceiling. And here, Fiona Allardyce on the right, she set out 150mm grid, and then we drew in the whole of the ceiling as best as we could from the photographs. And here's one of the masks. Pretty much escaped most of the fire damage. The other one up the other end was really quite badly damaged, but still obviously in pieces. But the importance of this is that it gave a huge amount of information about what and how these things were made. Miller, in his Plastering Plain and Decorative of 1897, goes through various hoops, as does Bankart in 1927, all trying to work out exactly how material was done in the olden times. Geoffrey Beard, I wrote a chapter to bolt onto his decorative plaster in Great Britain because he had confessed to me when he wrote the materials chapter, the old builder that he had spoken to had died and Geoffrey had lost his notes and just pretty much made it up. And it is a hopeless chapter on materials, and it took me weeks and weeks trying to understand what it really meant, this difference between stucco, lime, these are, they were interchangeable words, and he didn't really understand what he was talking about on the material side. And that can be a problem when you come to trying to recreate, restore, reconstruct, whatever term you wish to use. And here from the little parlour, this is also up arc, and you can see embedded in the dirt, these lines show how the freehand modelling was worked. These are the sketching done by the modeller originally, just altering the dimensions and the twist and the turn of that particular curve to fit with what the whole scheme was going to look like across that ceiling. Now, you can do these things in other materials, but they are not the same. And this is what I'm really here to try and show this evening. These deeper scratches, by the way, are to give a key to the material, because once you put the plaster on, it's got to have something to grip to. And here, little parlour, in the process of being remodelled, these paler bits of material are salvaged elements, and the rest of it is all being part of the remodelling that's going on, having had slightly better photographs for the little parlour. So it all been drawn up full size, and then the design transferred onto the ceiling and modellers modelling. Now, various things have been said in the not too distant past about how impossible it must be to get the modellers to do this kind of thing. Well, it had been 150 years, as I said. These techniques really hadn't been used since the 1830s because they'd been superseded by faster setting materials, cements, plaster of Paris, other materials, like in 1856 we get papier-mâché, fibrous plaster coming in. Papier-mâché had been around from the 1750s. There were lots of things that were quicker, could be done off-site in a workshop, then brought to site and assembled onto a ceiling to produce a kind of unit piece of fabrication. But here in the stair hall, only one or two bits of salvage material. The big thing is not trying to get people who are capable of doing the modelling, it's the cost of it and the programme time. You can't do this over in a workshop while everything else and all the other trades do their work. You have to do it in situ, directly there on the surface. And Louise here, you can see modelling away, and in the background and on the ceiling, you can see the scratching and the drawing out of the whole design to give an idea of where the ornament has to go. I should add that this great big donut shape, most of it is taken up by timber work, because lime plaster takes so long to go off. You're looking at 3 weeks per inch in thickness, and you can only do about an inch at a time without other setting additives. It's incredibly restrictive. Certainly in this country. On the continent, things went a lot quicker, but in Britain and Ireland, it was slow and very, very labour intensive. This gives a good idea of just how it goes. It's a completely additive process, unlike carving, where you start with a block and you remove material to find the form inside. Brilliant picture of Cluny earlier. This goes from the surface upwards. And if you make a mistake, you really are better off just scratching it off and starting again, because I'm sure most of you will have been at the seaside at some point as a child making sandcastles. As the moisture goes out of your sandcastle, when you first pop it on the ground, your lollipop stick, first of all, makes lovely grooves, but after about 2 or 3 minutes, it just scratches the surface unless you make it wet again, and then you usually just melt the whole thing. Modelling in situ, you have a pretty limited time frame. You've probably got about 30 minutes. And so when you start adding, you can't go back. You can't just bulk up something and then go back and do a little bit of twiddling and a few more grooves. You have to move it from the surface upwards. You're sketching in 3 dimensions through knowledge and understanding of the form and how to do it. So although on that upper left, you've penciled in the general movement and shape that you want, the moment you start scratching the surface, as you see in the top right, you've lost all the delicacy, so there's no point of putting too much detail in. And then in the bottom left, this is where you start applying a coarser mix to get the mass and the bulk and the general flow and form of your material, of what you're trying to do. And then in the bottom right, you're using a smaller small tool, plasterer's small tool, brilliantly descriptive, using a much finer mix of very fine sand and lime to produce that fine surface and to finish it. And that kind of leaf is probably about 45 minutes to an hour from when you start. So when you consider an entire ceiling, like that red drawing room ceiling, you're looking at a team of modellers and weeks and weeks to complete a ceiling in this country and in Ireland. As I say, not on the continent, where plaster of Paris gets added, much, much quicker setting. Things are done in a more impressionistic way and much more rapidly. So up in the top left, that's the saloon being completely reconstructed at Upark. Lime plaster onto laths. And in the bottom left, that's the little parlour. Same lime plaster, just slightly different aggregate, different techniques, running the moulding. From the left side, that's the coarser blocking out of the material onto timber laths, getting the form and the shape. And the white bit coming in, that's the finer top bit where the mould is slightly changed to get the sharpness. When you hit the mitre, any internal mitre, you can't get all the way in. You can only get to the very top corner. And after that, you make it up by hand. So that's as far as you can get in. And all this bottom bit is made up with a joint rule. It's all done by hand. The great thing of running in situ is that it follows any of the undulations and discrepancies in a ceiling. It's not like putting up cast lengths of plaster, which then vary in their depth on the fillets. This follows anything that is there on the wall. And this is over a decade after Upark had finished. This is at Thornhill. It was a 1730s house in Dorset, Thornhill being the family home of the painter Thornhill, James Thornhill. And the then owner in 2005 wishing to have decorative plaster in their stair hall. And these are people who hadn't been at Upark. They were still at school when that was happening, carrying on and learning these techniques of freehand modelling. This lady, she was an art student, and you can see the amount of projection and an incredible kind of feeling that you can get from using lime plaster. This is at Sudbury Hall. This is 1776, some of Bradbury and Pettifer's work of faith, hope and charity, with justice overseeing them at the top. This is right in the middle of the kind of drama of what you get with hand-modelled material. You can't get this in any other way other than standing there and modelling it. I should add that although it was painting, Charlton Heston is the only person in the world who has ever lain down to do this. It's pure Hollywood. People stand. Whereas it's, if you imagine lying, trying to plaster or paint, you only got about 3 feet to the ceiling. All the paint, all the gubbins just drops in your mouth, drops in your eyes. Your arm goes dead after about 5 minutes. Everyone normal stands with a scaffold about a hand height from the ceiling. So if you get the tallest person, you set the scaffold for that, and the shortest person just has a box to stand on. But it enables freedom of movement. This is an art and a craft. It's freedom of expression. Every little bit is unique, and each piece of work that you're looking at there has been hand-modelled and moved. Each bit's got to be complete before you can move on to the next thing. All that three-dimensionality comes from armatures, and this is probably a very good example of it. John Abbott's work at the Royal Hotel Bideford of 1688 in the Kingsley Room. And this mask, all hand-modelled onto a wrought iron wire armature, and you can see his beard just at the bottom. You can see it's snapped, but it's only hanging on because there's a wire core in that. Lime plaster is a very manipulative, malleable material. It takes this good 3 weeks to harden sufficiently to have gained strength to stay there on its own. That tongue, to give you an idea, projects about 7 or 8 inches from the ceiling out through that mouth. It's an extraordinary ceiling, and it's not very high. It's probably about the height of these pendant globes above us. So it's a fabulous thing. You can lie down if you're really drunk and enjoy it. That is what lime plaster achieves, and it's a unique thing. It's hand done. It is unique to the person doing it. There'd be a team of modellers creating this, and there would be someone who's good at masks, someone who's good at leaves, someone who's good at various bits. But the master, like with an old master painting, would be doing the really tricky, really expressive elements. This is the exact opposite end. This is also plaster of Paris. Not really used in any great extent in buildings, in ceilings, until the latter part of the 18th century, when neoclassical ornament and the linearity had brought things down to very low relief, and the lack of undercut was no longer an issue to cast elements like egg and dart, pattery, rosettes, modillions. But first of all, you need a model. You need a clay model, and in fact we saw in Clooney's work, she was also working off a clay model at first. Clay, of course, is additive and subtractive, and you can take days, months, or years to do it, as long as you keep it covered in plastic, then it won't dry out. But in the top right, there at St Stephen, Walbrook, this was a wren church of 1688, and unfortunately lost in 1941, the bombing. And that is a cast plaster attempt at trying to recapture some of the vivacity of hand-modelled lime plaster. The bottom right, you can see one of the problems of casting rigid elements in a cornice, as you're showing on the left-hand side. You've got to cut them to fit varied wall lengths, and so you've got to be very careful how you design them to try to get the whole thing to flow together. That is at St Andrew Toban. This is another 1941 bomb and a reconstruction, all in plaster, cast plaster, lacking all that feeling. I hope you can see just in that it's rigid and not very good. Royal Kilmainham Hospital, you'd think that's brilliant, but as this slide shows, only the red is lime, Jackson's took this down in 1898 and put it up. It said perfectly facsimile, a perfect facsimile of the original, but in lighter, more modern material and architecturally better. All the blue is carton-pierre and papier-mâché. The green is solid cast plaster. All the white, the top half, is fibrous plaster. And one wonders then, what there is that's real about that. Equally, this repair of the 1762 Benjamin Carter panel at the Pantheon in Stour Head. On the left, a really, I think, poor attempt at a hand, but Montfaucon's 1662 reference that Carter had used, showing my remodelling in lime of his right hand. Rathan Castle, Gilt Room, 1790s, Athenian Stuart, never went there, but this was his design, and this is the coving, all done, hand done in lime plaster. And I'm sure you can see, even from the far corners, how varied all that is, and quite different to a mechanical reproduction that you would get from cast plaster. So the gambling Atari putty at Houghton Hall, 1726, all hand-modelled, all in situ, same principle that did Clarendon, the marble hall there. And I hope you can see that, like this 1757 work by the Robert West workshop at 20 Dominic Street in Dublin, after Boucher, an engraving by Boucher, that this is all quite different to what you can achieve in a cast plaster. This is all hand-modelled and unique. So hoping you'll hold that in your mind when you think of what's authentic and what's real, even if it's done today. Doing it in the appropriate materials makes a huge difference to what you actually end up with.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was amazing. And the images that you show us from Up Park, they are really inspiring and showing that correct academic reconstruction or reinstatement, it's possible. But the effects of such an endeavor, as you said, were wider than bringing back the iconic building, but it was like setting a new school of craftsmanship. It was like a pioneer project, and also set up the beginning of the practically reinstatement of the craftsmanship in UK. But most of all, as Simon Jenkins wrote in 1995, after everything was finished, Upwork, it's more than a house restored. It's an argument won. So with this, we will go forward to our next speaker, which is Michael Bevington, a researcher and author of various interesting architectural studies and studies of the classical world. He also sits in the Stowe Advisory Panel. Michael, please welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I feel very honoured to be amongst such distinguished company. Construction, destruction and reconstruction. The conservation of classical Clarendon contrasted with Morris's medievalism. Some objectors to reconstructing Clarendon's interior make emotive assumptions about falsifying the evidence instead of creating something honest. However, for their protection and conservation, ancient buildings need reconstruction after partial destruction by fire. This is a practical, intellectual process which creates a new but equally honest standard of evidence without falsifying the old. This is the natural life cycle of all buildings, especially classical, whose essence is symmetrical coherence. Thus, the Pantheon's Latin inscription states that it was built by Agrippa in 27 BC. However, what we now admire is reconstructed, apart from the portico, after its destruction by fire. The reconstructed Pantheon, rather than dishonestly falsifying the evidence, through our intellectual appreciation of its reconstruction, enhances our physical experience of entering Agrippa's Pantheon. As the most complete building surviving from the ancient world, the Pantheon emphasizes its architectural importance through the imperative of its restoration. Ruskin allowed modern interventions to save ancient buildings, better a crutch than a lost limb. Morris followed Ruskin in many ways, reading aloud Ruskin's chapter on Gothic architecture to his fellow students at Oxford. Morris was devoted to all things medieval, especially architecture, sharing Gilbert Scott's enthusiasm for reconstructing the medieval world through architecture, as in this reconstruction. The image on the left is of the medieval La Sainte-Chapelle, Paris, completed in 1248. To the right is Gilbert Scott's slightly different reconstruction, designed from 1853, contextualized on the right by the medieval Palmer's Tower at Exeter College, Oxford. Morris matriculated there with Edward Burne-Jones in 1852, as in fact I did 120 years later. In 1854, Scott also designed Exeter's library, again in medieval Gothic, contextualized near the medieval Duke Humphrey's Library. After taking his degree, Morris spent 2 years training under Street, another leading Gothic architect, and later inspired the arts and crafts movement through his medievalism. Indeed, Morris was president here at the Art Workers Guild, and his bust watches us from the niche above the master's chair, or it would without the screen there. However, by 1877, Morris condemned both Scott and Street for inaccurate restoration, and his manifesto led to the foundation of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. Morris's developing socialist vision valued the accrued patina of medieval sculpture by individual craftsmen over modern mass production. Nevertheless, his objection to unfaithful reconstruction is irrelevant in the era of modern archaeological evidence and detailed photography, and should now be understood within the context of his moral crusade. Morris's narrow outburst against industrialization or speculative Gothic restoration in the late 1870s cannot apply to accurate 21st century reconstruction of, for instance, Clarendon's classical interior. Indeed, the planners consented to the National Trust's application for listed building consent to include Clarendon's restoration, in this case of external facades. So the principle of reconstructing Clarendon through restoration has already been established and approved. Moreover, the inherent holistic unity of Clarendon's classical architecture, with its frequent repetition of identical forms, often identically manufactured through mouldings, is irrelevant to Morris's medievalism and individual carving. From the late 1720s, Leone reconstructed classical architecture and art at Clarendon in a way which now demands its holistic, not partial, reconstruction. The visual importance of reconstructing architectural and artistic details is evident in the restoration of copies of classical statues in the niches of the Marble Hall at Stowe House in Buckinghamshire, where the empty niches distort and falsify the intended vertical dimension. Similarly, the intended visual experience of the state dining room is restored by replica tapestries and chimney pieces, as also with the National Trust's restoration of George II's column and the Temple of Concord and Victory. Similar principles apply to the visitor's experience of Clarendon's giant Corinthian columns on the south front, contrasted with the single-story scale of columns originally decorating the Palladium room immediately inside the doorway. The same applied to moving from the A-styler west front into the Great Marble Hall with its 2 stories of attached Corinthian columns, and then progressing to view the same architectural space from the higher story, where the reduced scale of the order enhanced Leone's clever use of perspective. John Cornforth, in the National Trust Guidebook, described Clarendon's Marble Hall as unquestionably among the grandest of all 18th century interiors. Clarendon is not simply Leone's masterpiece, but also of much wider significance architecturally. Reconstruction has authentic provenance from the Pantheon onwards. Morris was concerned with the patina from pre-industrial individual medieval craftsmen, not repetitive identical classical mouldings or precise reconstructions based on detailed archaeology and photography. Morris's warnings against inauthentic 19th century medieval interventions are, in fact, equally opposed to 21st century interventions or tampering through modern walkways and falsified ceilings, incompatible with an 18th century classical context. The National Trust has already applied for and been granted listed building consent to restore Clandon's external facades. This now needs to be extended to the much more significant interior. Only interior reconstruction can protect Clandon's unique architectural role in its holistic interplay of exterior and interior forms and allow visitors to experience fully Leone's groundbreaking construction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your short but very convincing demonstration. And now we have the last speaker of our symposium, Christopher Griffiths, Heritage Director at HC UK Group, architectural historian with a broad experience of planning in the historic environment, and as a conservation officer and heritage consultant. Let's welcome Christopher Griffiths. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgia. So it's a real honour to be speaking at the Art Workers Guild, an institution I greatly admire about Clandon Park, a building which has long held a deep fascination for me. I first visited Clandon when I was studying the rise of Palladianism in Britain during my A-levels back in 1995. I found the house something of an enigma because of its hybrid character and unclear antecedents. Its quasi-Baroque interior and austere brick shell did not strike me at first as a bona fide Palladian mansion. A masterpiece, certainly, but something of an outlier, or sui generis, as country houses go. At the time, I did not appreciate that Clandon's roguish defiance of categorization conferred greater value rather than less. But in 1995, I quietly moved on to the main subject of my research, which was Kedleston Hall, an altogether much more straightforward building by the gentleman's same name. Unfortunately, the opportunity for closer study of the magnificent interior at Clandon did not arise until after the fire had destroyed much of it. However, the strength of the record and the body of work undertaken by others, including John Cornforth, Sophie Chesham and Christine Casey, meant that a forensic examination of the historic fabric remained very much a possibility after the fire. This is an important point, and my study was done in the context of compiling a detailed heritage report on behalf of Restore Trust in support of an objection to the National Trust's proposed scheme of consolidated reimagining, very much in a style of our time. Clandon is a building which certainly rewards a closer examination. And in endeavouring to better understand the building's significance, to fully appreciate the impact of the intended refurbishment, one cannot but become intimately aware of Clandon's seminal importance in the pantheon of British architectural history. The building speaks eloquently of the influence of Palladianism in the shaping of country house architecture in England. The cultural importance of Clandon to art and architecture in a wider context is emphatic, and its capacity to enrich the human experience both individually and collectively is undeniable. I will confess, it took little persuading for me to conclude that restoring Clandon Park to its pre-fire state remains much the better option from every objective measure, quite apart from any personal preference, and I'm talking about heritage and public benefits in the planning sense. The question of whether or not to restore a building like Clandon should, I believe, come down to gauging which outcome serves to enrich, ennoble and restore the human person the most, thereby benefiting society more at both the individual level and as a diverse multitude. This should be a holistic exercise with reference to objective and measurable criteria, including what people genuinely value. If art and artwork has a value, it is precisely its capacity to lift one out of the mundane concerns of the material realm, from the bounds of what may at times seem like a humdrum existence, to see that there is indeed something beyond and greater than oneself. From my experience at least, the fine arts reconnect us with the metaphysical, the spiritual side of human nature. At least good art does that. And in doing so, we are able to provide a clear sense of purpose and meaning, uniting the intellect and the will in the pursuit of what is good, true, and beautiful. This is a noble aim and something which we do well as a society to encourage whenever possible. Now, I do not doubt that retaining what remains of Clarendon as what can best be described as an emaciated carcass can yield valuable insights into the life and practice of a bricklayer in the early 18th century. The austere brick shell could provide opportunities to hear about the travails of a housekeeper or an under-butler in 1800, done by way of some innovative interactive display or use of AI, but essentially leaving a lot to the imagination. This is a valid perspective, and there is, of course, an admirable honesty in presenting what the fire has destructively bequeathed to generate something interesting out of a tragic event. However, my main point is that since it is entirely possible to recreate the glorious interiors of Clarendon based on what we do know and with the skills at our disposal to make it a reality, is it not incumbent on us as custodians to preserve, celebrate, and pass on to future generations the best of what we have inherited, adding to it and improving on it if we can? Indeed, there is an opportunity to put right what Atari got wrong with the lower limbs of Hercules and Omphale, and recreate the amazingly complex concealed roof structure of Leone's original house. Restoration brings with it very considerable opportunities for enhancement. The irony is that these opportunities would not have existed but for the fire. In recognising Clarendon's overarching significance down the centuries, I am of course appealing to the common sense that underpins the entire heritage protection system, something which is ordered hierarchically according to the level of human ingenuity, skill, and, in a word, love that went into its creation. Thus, the bare masonry walls, studded with occasional fragments of damaged ornamental plasterwork, though interesting, do not convey the same level of special interest, artistic value, or cultural meaning as a meticulously planned and sumptuously executed interior, be it authentic work of 1729 or a recreation of it. Indeed, the relationship of one room to another and the importance of each part to the whole as a complete work of art is fundamental to Clarendon's exceptional heritage value. Thus, I would say the argument for restoring Clarendon tends to make itself. It is simply too important not to restore. And in that sense, I would say the case is unassailable. While, of course, there remains something significant about Clarendon in its post-fire state, even allowing for the most Hegelian of interpretations, one cannot, in any meaningful sense, say that its post-fire significance is greater than or presents an insuperable barrier to recovering its pre-fire significance. If this were true, the best thing one could do to a listed building would be to burn it down, which is, of course, certified nonsense. The same argument applies in the case of Notre Dame Cathedral, Windsor Castle, Hampton Court, etc., and Up Park. Fortunately, none of these great buildings is now characterised by an emphasis on functional design, geometric forms, abstract volumes which are at best incidental, and a rejection of ornamentation. Instead, something like the original beauty, glorious workmanship, and crafted excellence of those places has been successfully recaptured, yielding a new patrimony for the benefit of you and I and future generations. I could be wrong, of course. Perhaps I'm just the proverbial naysayer, unsophisticated in my old-school approach to restoration in this particular case. However, I am genuinely struggling to see the Emperor's new clothes on this occasion. The plain matter of fact that only a great work of art can convey will be conspicuously absent in this new incarnation of Clarendon. The joy and delight that accompanies a celebration of human endeavour, patrimony and artistic excellence give way to feelings of dismay and indifference. While there may be a lofty ideal behind the proposed plans, the fact is the old house was much better in every sense, more relatable, much more successful in satisfying the irrepressible human need for what is good, true and beautiful. As the experience of Up Park ably demonstrates, pre-fire significance can be recovered, and as such there is no good reason not to do this at Clarendon Park, and indeed every good reason to do it. The beautiful 18th century gates at Merrow are inscribed with the Onslow family motto, Semper Fidelis. I believe those entrusted with the care of special places should be faithful to what animates these places and gives them their stamp of originality. Clarendon's specialness is undoubtedly its remarkable interiors concealed within an elegant brick box. Instead of reimagining it as a distinctly less special place, why not do something remarkable again and bequeath the next generation a legacy that will truly stand the test of time? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was a really moving presentation, and the images spoke for themselves. So I would like to thank very much to all the speakers this evening on the second panel, and to start the discussion on this panel. So I would invite all the speakers on the stage. And please feel free to express your opinions, your support, or your disagreement with the speakers. And I would like to start eventually to ask our very distinguished invite, Duncan McCallum, Chair of the Society of the Protection of Ancient Buildings, on his opinion on the topics that we discuss. But first, let the speakers get to the stage, please.
Thank you very much, both the first set of speakers and second set as well. Really, really stimulating array of perspectives. As you introduced me, I'm Chair of the Society of Protection of Ancient Buildings. Prior to that, I worked for English Heritage and Historic England for many years in the policy area. I've got kind of 3 points, and no doubt some of you might want to pick up on these. First of all, I suppose, is do the technical one, policy stuff. I think I've found it very interesting being involved in policy for a long time. I'm talking about England, but probably a large part of the UK. Is that the Venice Charter in government policy terms hasn't played a huge part, I don't think. And although there are elements that follow through, my take on it is that the government, central government, has been very, very clear that it doesn't want to impose a particular style, and it's rigorously tried to avoid saying a particular style is preferred. And that opens all kinds of possibilities. I think the downside can be when it reaches the local level, and Doncaster local plan was mentioned. In my English Heritage former hat, I used to cover Doncaster. Doncaster needs all the help it can get in terms of beauty and conservation and thoughtfulness. And it's a shame when people are trying to impose a particular style. I don't think that's what is intended. And I think the policy tries to be flexible. Obviously, you may not feel it is. And in terms of the English Heritage and Historic England guidance, we had a process we used to call de-shouldification, which was you write a guidance document about whatever it might be, context or different styles, and then you'd go through and look for every should in the document and say, is it a requirement to do that, or is it something that it's encouraged to think about this approach? And generally, I think you'll find in that guidance, the point is there are general principles, and I think all of us generally agree on what those are, about thinking something through and about a consistency of approach. And for me, I suppose, moving now on to the second point, which was around Society of Protection of Ancient Buildings. Perhaps it's good that William Morris is hidden from me at the moment, because a thunderbolt might come down my way. But my reading of what he was, his approach and how that's been interpreted, is that Ruskin and Morris started that challenge against an approach in the 19th century, which was seeing that there was only one way of doing things, and that was at the time very destructive. I think things have changed a lot now, and there are a range of different approaches, and I'd say not just Morris and Ruskin and SPAB and the other amenity societies all together have collectively encouraged a system where challenge is part of it, and that people can sort of think through their approach. And if they think through that approach, whether it be a classically inspired traditional approach or a modern approach, if that is consistently argued, it, in my view, can be a successful scheme. I suppose I should admit, probably dangerously liberal in SPAB terms. And one of the great things about the organisation, why I love chairing it, is that people love to argue all the time. William Morris, as we know, loved to argue. He often disagreed with himself in his writings. So I think for me, the great thing is being here and hearing the debate. I may not agree with everybody on this particular point, on some of the points that were made, and you probably all know SPAB's perspective on Clarendon. But I love the fact that we can have these conversations. And for me, in terms of the kind of next step, I'm really keen that we have these debates more widely as well, so that more, the wider public can engage in these sorts of things. My final point was just about skills. I completely agree, skills are incredibly important. 95 years ago, SPAB introduced, skill for the scholarships, and it's been funding that, and other organisations have too. And I think whether those skills are applied in traditional ways or in modern ways, I think that is so important. And I think anything we can do together to encourage the rejuvenation of skills, the expansion of skills training is something that I would strongly support. So I don't really have any question other than if anybody wants to come back to me, but thank you for these thoughts. And I do think having these wider discussions beyond this, perhaps with SPAB, have a really good few drinks and an argument. It is a good way to air these views, test them out, and also encourage other wider people to take part in these discussions. Anyone want to come back on that?
Thank you. Other questions? Do you have to add something? On Clarendon, or Francis, about the non-imposition of a style. I know that you had some problems with some conservation officer who practically wanted a particular style.
This is not related to anything I showed. At the moment, I'm trying to... in Colchester, my hometown, they found a Roman racetrack, and there's nothing left of it. You can't see a thing. And me and the local politician and a few others clubbed together and thought we wanted to do something with this thing, because it's just a bit of suburban Colchester. It's of no interest to anyone, actually. And what we thought would be nice is to rebuild the starting gates on the original foundations. And as far as SPAB, not just SPAB, Historic England goes, it's just absolutely no, forget it, never do it. And, I think that this site will just remain a piece of suburban Colchester. People will forget that there's this amazing Roman circus under there. But the possibility of damaging the foundations or building on this circus seems to be the more important issue than educating the public about this thing. And I do think the dial is... I can understand why Ruskin and so on and Morris wanted to push the dial. I can see that they were anti this very mechanistic way, and the whole of culture was becoming too mechanical, I guess. And they just wanted to push the dial the other way. But unfortunately, I think it's just stuck there at the moment, because I can't get anywhere with Historic England on this. I mean, I don't know whether you can answer that. I just thought I'd share my grievance.
Adaptation of the Charter in 2006, published in 2007, it mentions that recreating historical material is fine so long as an expert can detect it. Now that seems to me quite a move forward. The fact that other clauses in the adaptation or gloss on the Charter say rather opposite things, leaves one to choose, I would suggest. But I wonder whether people have used Article 4 in arguments with conservation officers and others. That was one point. The other point I want to make, because I've got to rush off soon, is that it's fascinating to look at how SPAB was able to exert pressure and get support for William Morris's mantra, if one can call it that, before the advent of modernism. As we know, modernism is now a style 100 years old, and we do lots of other things, as has been mentioned. But all that stuck with conservation officers, the modernism, which is often rather unpleasant with old buildings. On the other hand, it can be marvellous, but all too often it's inconsidered and brash. But looking at the pre-modernism, there's some very fascinating examples, and I do advise people to look at what Avery Tipping did at Brinsop Court in Herefordshire. It's described in the first volume of English Homes, where the medieval, substantial medieval fragments, buildings, and later work, and a great deal missing, and a hell of a mess in the early 20th century, and it was made into a wonderful house. And how he sort of invented a style that's not quite amongst those buildings already, but at least half the building is of this new manner, and it's created something really wonderful. It's an absolute, it's a huge success of what William Morris believed. And before the work was done, it was submitted to SPAB, and William Weir approved it, and then it was built. I do think it's a seminal example that's worth considering, and think about, well, it relates to many of the things we've talked about now.
I just wanted to make a few points about planning policy that Duncan was touching on before. I remember doing a seminar with you for planning inspectors on heritage at risk about 13 years ago. All in the past. But I think, generally speaking, the Historic England guidance strikes a good balance. I mean, the whole principle of intelligently managed change, which is spoken of in the PPG 15, that was it. And it kind of underpins the approach of the national guidance. Is a good one. But applying that to the case of Clarendon Park in this case, it just seems that that necessarily hasn't quite been applied, because you've got to look at all things in terms of whether the scheme that's coming forward is actually going to work in the long term, or have they analysed what the public benefits are of the particular scheme they're proposing and weighed them against the alternative, which is restoration. It just seemed to me, when in looking at that case in detail, that exercise hasn't been done. But in terms of sort of the Doncaster case, where you've got sort of dogmatic principles coming down into local authority, that there is a danger for public policy to stifle creativity in the architects' certainly profession, and architects will plan to get planning permission rather than plan for building a beautiful building or a good house that's actually going to work for people, and that is a real danger. That needs, this intelligent management of the process needs to kind of come out more, because computer says no sort of planning approach can really mess things up. Anyway, that's my 2 pence on that.
Could I just add a couple of anecdotes? I'll leave them to you in a sense. But where you saw the Temple of Concord and Victory, and the school in its wisdom removed the columns and put them into the chapel, now a listed building, so they couldn't be returned. And when we had a discussion on what to do with the building after the school had given it to the National Trust, I think it was a representative from English Heritage said, keep the bricks, that's how you found it, you should leave it. And the school said, well, we didn't give it to the National Trust to leave it as bricks. The whole point was to try and restore these buildings. So that seems to me somewhat relevant to Clarendon. We're not trying to preserve a monument to an electrical fault. We're trying to allow visitors to understand what Leone wanted to create, how brilliant it was. And the other one is in the state dining room, all the tapestries, and indeed the chimney pieces, and we may have someone here who is responsible for that. With a long discussion, should you put the tapestries taken with marvellous modern photography onto a form of cloth, linen, or should they be on a wall covering? We went for the wall covering, problems with dining rooms and so on, but it's so good, almost everyone goes straight up to the wall to touch it, to make sure that they aren't being deceived by their eyes. And that's how good, I think, modern reconstructions can be. Enough said. Thank you.
Other questions?
Thank you, and thank you for an excellent discussion and series of very thought-provoking presentations. And hello, Duncan. It's nice to see you again. Look, the whole episode with Clarendon has clearly been very upsetting and retrograde, and is a expression of dogma over a common sense. I think it was Morris. I hope I'm not doing him a disservice. I may be. I think he said when Scott died, it was a happily dead dog, which I think opens up important questions about how we actually think about what we should or shouldn't do, and not getting over-motivated. I think Duncan is right that the Venice Charter doesn't directly influence government policy. I don't think there are officials sitting there reading it. I suspect the vast, vast majority of people in the Heritage Department have never even heard of it, unlike everyone in Historic England who has, because they're expert and well-informed. But that does not mean that its implications don't percolate very profoundly and widely through to what actually happens, not just on issues of restoration, such as at Clarendon House, but actually also into issues of new design, new development up and down the country. I can certainly think of, without even sort of pausing for breath, lots of schemes we've been involved in, either designing or advising on, where the clearly popular view of people locally that towns should be renatured, that streets should be restitched, that walkability should be recreated, are actively opposed by planning officials, including by heritage officials, on grounds that it's falsifying of history. The fact that it's more popular, more walkable, more sustainable, more resilient, more endurable, comes into tension with that, clearly. So I guess that prompts the question, how do we make sure that this never happens again? I mean, clearly it's been a very retrograde step versus Art Park and Hampton Park and Windsor, and clearly it's off beam. So I was in Berlin the other day, the work that Thomas Albrecht and others are doing to the Royal Palace there. I think you talked about it before I joined a bit earlier, what's happening in Warsaw, what's happening in France. We're seeing a growing theme of the re-beautification, the restitching, the reweaving of our towns and cities after their denaturing mid-century by the bombs of air forces and by the bombs of post-war traffic modernism. Why have we, because it's not just Morris and Spab, why have we gone off beam from what's happening across Germany and France and Holland, and how on earth, in your judgment, expert panel, and indeed Chairman Spab, if you wish to, how do we come back on beam so we're forging a more resilient future as opposed to sort of crashing out on our own on this?
I mean, I suppose it is interesting. It's a really, really good question, and it's a $1 million question, isn't it? Because, but how much is it to do with the public debate? And that's your field. That's where you work. But is that one of the aspects of both, particularly architecture and the nature of its sort of training and professionalism, and also perhaps conservation in its own sort of internal dialogues? How much do they percolate? How much are they part of that broader public discussion, so that all of in a two-way process? How often does SBAB, engage with a public arena of non-SBAB people? One of the things I love about SBAB is it trains lots of people, has lots of wonderful, and they then sort of fill your committees. And in fact, I'm with them. Although I've said something slightly different from SBAB policy, I'm actually with training SBAB people tomorrow. It's one of the things I do every year. But it is, I think sometimes it can encourage, in order to give strength to the conservation group, a sort of, we're in this stockade together looking out. And I wonder how much the SBAB does to engage a wide public debate about these things. So it's only a question that occurred in response to his question, but here you are.
we're coming up to our 150th anniversary, and one of the things we want to do is to engage the public more widely about exactly these kinds of things. So I completely agree with you. The danger for all organisations like our own is that we can become too inward-looking, but boy, it doesn't feel like that when you're trying to run a board. So yeah, there's a huge amount of dissent within the organisation to arrive at a decision. I suppose the other point, really, on what Nicholas was saying, you've done great things, in my view, in the last few years in raising awareness, thinking about the kind of design issues, bringing that to the government's mind, which has, I think, made a big difference. In my view, there will always be a few bad architects, a few bad planners, a few bad conservation officers who perhaps don't get that wider perspective, and sometimes through pressure of work or other circumstances or their own particular view that only one route is the right route and it's their route, you can end up with bad buildings, bad decisions. And I think that's the challenge, really, that I guess it's as much for this organisation as it is for my own or other amenity societies and local authorities and IHBC and others to try and get that debate out more widely, because that's the way we're going to get people to think more broadly, and by having these kind of discussions, frankly, and spreading that, using the internet, social media, that kind of thing, to shift the dial where it needs shifting and to celebrate good things. Personally, I'm comfortable with the Clarendon's line that SPAB has taken. The National Trust have a particular view. It's tested against government policy. Many of you in the room won't like that outcome. But there is at least a system in this country that, there's heritage statements, there's applications. There is a process that people have to go through to demonstrate that there is some justification for a particular line that they're taking. And we may not like those outcomes, but at least it's there, and we're not going to like all the decisions that happen.
Nicholas said what has gone wrong, and what I think has gone wrong is we've forgotten what things ought to look like. We're not concerned these days about what things actually look like, and that is because we have broken with the tradition where people would teach composition, they would talk about aesthetics, and that actually, which is also the point that Francis made, is that it goes through all of the visual arts. All of the visual arts are in complete crisis because the ties with tradition and the past have been completely severed, where anything goes and where you have to be original and you have to make some sort of statement. That is the problem. I remember when I was being trained as an architect at the School of Architecture, which in fact was Kingston all those years ago, no one who was teaching ever said, if you did this, it would look better. If you made that like that, it would be a better composition. There was no aesthetic visual reference in that course of architecture whatsoever. And that is what has gone wrong, and it is permeating all of the visual arts, I think.
I wanted to draw the conversation back to democracy and decision-making, because if we think back to the Venice Charter in 1964, we have a self-appointed group of people who then proclaimed their expertise in decision-making and set about taking over the world of planning and so on, so that their view held. And to a certain extent, Ruskin and Morris, admirable people, but setting themselves up as experts in decision-making. I think back to one of the earliest things we did with INTBAU in 2001. We were called in by local people in Dresden because in 2000 they had the Frauenkirche was under reconstruction after being a ruin for 50 years, as it was permitted to be. Local people prevented the ruins being cleared after the war. And a group of modernist German architects have proposed rebuilding Dresden in this sort of awful style. Local people were upset. They called in, they heard about INTBAU, they called us in, we did an alternative. It was then put to a public vote. 70% of people voted for a historical reconstruction of the city centre, which we now see largely executed very successfully. And that seems to me, if you ask the people, you'll get an answer that perhaps experts don't like, but which people like. And we shouldn't forget that these are public acts, and that, I think in terms of conservation, the Borough Charter, 1979, the Australian version of the Venice Charter, if you like, it reintroduced consulting the public and asking them what they valued as an important step into decision making. So it overtook the expertism of the Venice Charter, in which a group of isolated experts, unelected, make decisions for everyone. And I think English heritage principles, another excellent document which talks all about what people actually want. We need to bring back public decision making and community engagement in deciding what gets built, basically. And I don't think it's appropriate necessarily for these decisions to be made solely by people who are not representative. Anyway, that's it.
I wanted to quote something from SPAB, a website an explanation of SPA conservation approach, complement not parody. A new work should express modern needs in modern language. These are the only terms in which the new can relate to the old in a way which is positive and responsive at the same time. This comes from SPAB's website. Enough said.
Allow me, I feel that maybe Duncan needs a bit of protection here. I mean, he'll never come again if we all gang up on him, but
Last question.
Oh,
thank you very much. I just want to point out that the National Trust's argument for leaving Clarendon as a ruin with modern interventions rests on some statements which are contentious, to say the least. First, they do violence to the concept of significance by claiming that this Palladian mansion has significance created by the fire. Secondly, in their design statement, they claim that Artari's plasterwork is like a unique artwork that can never be recreated. And then thirdly, linked with that, they say again and again, to justify what they want to do, that the skills do not exist. I think we know very well. They say even specifically that the plastering techniques are poorly understood. Well, they're very, very well understood by John Ireland, at least.
Absolutely. Yeah, so, I mean, I think am I allowed to round up? But I mean, we all need a drink, don't we? I mean, even the teetotalers among us need water. We'll just hang. I will try, and if I may, just sort of an impossible job of sort of squaring circles. But I think one thing about, say, not wishing to corner SPAB completely, but also wishing to corner SPAB completely, we know that we have to deal with these paradoxes. And Duncan, I don't know if you were here when I started this off, but I did introduce this quote of Alva Aalto, "We should not be so dogmatic." And I think I also showed the extensions to the Holborn Museum, which I had supported, but actually rather regret, because it just so happened that Bath Preservation Trust, it was split half and half, and I tipped them over the edge. But, so I think we have to reflect, and I think SPAB should reflect on the fact that Morris would have probably been rather upset at the effect on craft that this kind of decision has. And I think, Matthew's point about democracy and the people, I mean, that's not for you, Duncan, or for anyone else here, but that is ultimately, I think it would be a very sane direction. And in terms of explanation of sort of Russ, I think we had a couple of things, why we got here. Well, I think Francis also had it in the urinal of Marcel Duchamp, putting it up on the wall, or the moustache on the Mona Lisa. The gesture of sort of this kind of gesture is so easy for the public to understand and get. It's so sort of attractive, and really ultimately then to end up with Christopher, I may, who I haven't met before today, I think ultimately the Duchamp technique and this an appropriation art, which is long established since he was around, is ultimately somewhat voyeuristic and somewhat, if you like, it's ruin porn, is what we're going to see at Clarendon. Whereas Christopher was talking about love. And, without going too much into a sort of sexual psychology, I think we prefer love to porn. But anyway, so have a drink, everyone.